What's up, dude?
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing reasonably well. How are you?
I'm doing all right.
Dude, yesterday was a super kick-ass stream. I don't know if you
Oh
saw the
yeah.
Facebook post. Yeah, we got put into the Blizzard launcher. So everyone who's loading up
Oh,
StarCraft got to see Neuro scouting class.
yeah, I did see that.
Yeah, that was very exciting. It felt like a big
Cool.
potato situation.
Nice. Moving on up.
Yeah. So I know you sent me a thing about China. I didn't get a chance to read it yet. What is the TLDR of this?
I don't know. I don't remember.
Dystopian sci-fi. You're sure U.S. politics will handle the implications with characteristic grace and wisdom. That sounds like sarcasm. In your
What the
face,
hell was that?
China's all-seeing state.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, that was just a little video that the BBC World News released that kind of looked into this new security system that's being set up in
Mm.
China in certain cities for now, but they're going to try to roll it out countrywide
Mm.
eventually. And I just thought it was kind of creepy because a lot of they're setting up a CCTV camera network in the participating cities, and that's not unusual. Lots of cities do that. But what's unique about this system is that the central control processes the imagery such that it can recognize faces and record faces and who you're with and all manner of sort of sci-fi type stuff. They're kind of leveraging artificial intelligence and facial recognition software to kind of up the ante to take surveillance to the next level. And I just thought it was a little bit creepy.
Yeah, it seems very Minority Report is upon us kind of thing.
Yeah, and China's very much kind of pioneering that. The party has no qualms about things like privacy and individual rights, so they're quite happy to invest quite a bit of resources into technologies that allow them to kind of intrude into people's lives and monitor them and improve the security of the state, and specifically the party in particular.
Yeah, well, that kind of fits with the notion of collectivism versus individualism, where they're very concerned with the well-being of the country, the nation at large, or at least that's kind of the underlying philosophy for that. And privacy is more of a thing that individuals seek, as opposed to, for group psychology, generally speaking, it's better if the cards are kind of laid open on the table. But the downside is a lack of privacy can be used against you unfairly in many capacities. So a lot of people still think that privacy is a very, very good thing and important right for human beings.
Unfortunately, people in power do not share that sentiment all too frequently. And powerful politicians in places like China and Russia are fertile markets for that kind of technology. In fact, I don't know how much of it, but a chunk of it is actually developed in the West and sold by Western vendors to clients in other countries, authoritarian countries generally. And I think somebody was talking about, I think it was a European politician in the European Parliament, European Union Parliament, was talking about banning the export of devices used for torture.
Hmm.
Things like, these sort of cattle prod type devices and restraints and things like that were being used by authoritarian regimes in their, well, authoritarian national security apparatus, specifically the internal security wing of their national security apparatus. And I think here in the United States there was some talk about, well, the military specifically was making noise about limiting Chinese investment into dual-use technologies. There's a fear that there are certain technologies that can be used for both civilian uses but also military uses, or in this context, internal security operations, be they repressive or otherwise, and that in order to maintain America's advantage, at least in the military sphere, the national security sphere, it would be wise to limit investment by Chinese entities into such dual-use technologies and the firms that produce them. And a good number of those firms are in, Silicon Valley and other tech hotspots here in the United States. That's more of a that's more on the national security side of things rather than on the internal repression side of things. But hypothetically, it's quite possible and even likely that the Chinese government and its allied entities in the Chinese economy are investing in such technologies in the United States in order to kind of get an inside track on them. Artificial intelligence in particular was one that kind of kept popping up, and I think there were others too that I don't quite remember. Now let's see, we did have a question. How would you recommend researching the subjective growth of the U.S. economy? For example, I have heard the U.S. economy has grown since 2010. Contra-wise, I have heard that there are too many part-time jobs. Contra-wise, I have heard average Joe pay, adjusted for inflation, has not increased for 40 years. On the other hand, the U.S. is the richest country in the world. Researching the subjective growth of the U.S. economy. It's quite possible for an economy to be large, powerful, and growing, and to have all of these features. I mean, there's no rule that says a growing, prosperous economy has to give lots of well-paying middle-class jobs to people. In fact, for most of history, that wasn't the case. You know, certainly in the Industrial Revolution, economic development was defined by poverty, misery, poor living conditions, things like that, and most of the wealth went to elites, you know, sort of the what we called in the United States at that time robber barons. I don't know if that's a term that was used outside the United States as much, but basically it referred to oligarchs, very powerful economic actors who grew immensely wealthy on the back of industrialization and its effect, so to speak, on the economy at that time. So kind of a similar dynamic now. The economy is growing, and it is relatively healthy. It kind of needs to be growing more, really, in order to be really considered in order to be considered to be experiencing a strong period of growth. This is more just mild growth, but it's doing that in the context of rising inequality. The nature of the growth is such that most of the gains are going to relatively few people, generally innovators, owners, managers, people like that. The working class is getting relatively few of those gains, and in turn, the wealth gap is growing. And part of that is manifesting as the growth in part-time jobs. Hiring full-time workers comes with certain costs, more so in Europe than the United States, but you know, even here there are added costs and regulation stemming from regulations that make it relatively more expensive to hire someone full-time rather than just hiring a part-time worker or a temporary worker. And so there's been a big movement in the United States and Europe to kind of move away from regular full-time jobs to more temp workers of one sort or another, be they part-time or full-time, in order to get around the regulations on full-time workers. And that makes labor cheaper, and in turn, companies are more cost competitive. But it also kind of makes it more difficult to move up the social ladder. And it destabilizes communities to a degree, in the sense that you don't have as much job security with a temp job or a part-time job as you do with a full-time job. And you know, you could kind of get into a chicken and egg argument as to whether, you know, it's the jobs themselves and the lack of full-time, if it's the lack of full-time jobs that's creating that kind of instability, or if there's more structural economic changes that are creating the need for those kinds of jobs, and that's more the root cause of it. But regardless, it's harder for labor in the modern economy than it has been in the past, on account of the way that the economy has shifted and where the jobs are located and how production is done. And as for pay not increasing, that's the inequality outside of it. You know, pay has stagnated for, I think in the United States, for a couple of decades, probably since the 70s or so. You know, part of that had to do with the oil crisis and other, you know, mitigating factors, and it actually did grow a fair bit in the 1990s. But largely it stagnated, especially for people in the bottom income brackets. They in particular have kind of been on the outside looking in, so to speak. But none of these things, basically, what I'm saying is none of these things are mutually exclusive. There's no reason an economy can't feature all of these things. It's quite possible for the United States economy to be growing and be the richest country in the world at the same time that it has a large growth in part-time jobs and stagnating pay. You know, what economic growth in and of itself is easy to get if you know what to do. What's difficult is to get an ideal kind of economic growth that facilitates a large middle class, high income, job security, etc., all the sort of little goodies. The United States and to a degree Europe kind of takes those things for granted because of the post-war period, when those things were very predictable and stable and readily available. But the post-war period was kind of fleeting. The circumstances that made that a prosperous period are not really replicable, and were pretty much inevitably going to disappear with time, or at least mitigate with time. And you know, really, it's a good thing it's not replicable, because part of the reason the era was so prosperous was catch-up economic growth, which is where basically you have a low degree of economic development and you're catching up to where you should be. That alone generated a lot of growth in that period. And the reason there was a lack of economic development at that time in Europe was, of course, because of World War II. Everybody got blown up. You know, the infrastructure was decimated, economic links were disrupted, there was just a lot of churn. Well, churn, not even churn, just a lot of devastation from the conflict. And recovering from that laid the groundwork for a significant amount of growth. And then further growth was generated because they were able to invest in new equipment, new technology, new capital to replace what had been destroyed before. One of the reasons the U.S. economy started to kind of stagnate in the late 60s and 1970s was because they never replaced a lot of their capital. You know, it was kind of older capital. And so when the Germans and the Japanese were investing in new capital in the 1950s and 60s, they kind of leapfrogged their U.S. competitors. And that laid the groundwork for a significant period of relative U.S. weakness in the global economy. Not quite sure how I got onto that, kind of lost my train of thought, but the point is these are not mutually inclusive things. So how would I recommend researching the subjective growth of the U.S. economy? Just get into the weeds, basically. Get into the details. You know, kind of look at the kind of economic growth. Look at employment. Look at wages. Look at wages according to income bracket. Look at unemployment according to income bracket. Look at unemployment. Well, you can't look at unemployment according to income bracket, but look at unemployment according to demographics and other categories. You know, as best you can. Background, race, region. You know, the spatial element gets overlooked a lot. Look at spatial differences in unemployment and income. Look at industries and sectors and how they vary. Really, if you want to do a deep analysis of an economy, these are the things you kind of have to do. And making a measure of what economic growth the country has, how prosperous it is, etc., and how to reach an economic status quo that does deliver the desirable attributes of economic growth. Again, job stability, high income, high middle class, etc. A lot of that requires a deeper analysis that would allow you to pinpoint areas where you could improve, specific policy areas. So that's roughly off the top of my head, that would be my recommendation. Let's see, so then the next one was, oh, and for the last question, if you want me to go into more detail or elaboration, feel free to ask, I'm happy to. I don't always give the best answers off the top of my head, so feel free to ask for, you know, more elaboration or some other specific part of the question. I'd be happy to get into it as best I can. So the next question was thoughts on the repeal of net neutrality. Time will tell. I mean, it's a lot of the stuff people complained about was actually already legal under the pre-existing, well, now previous net neutrality provisions. I think the new thing that is now legal is data throttling, and it's unclear the extent to which the telecommunications industry will use that tool to extract value from content creators. I don't know that they'll really go more for the, what would you call them, customers. You know, the market it's not a monopoly, but it is monopolistic. The telecommunications market, specifically for ISPs, that's a monopolistic market. And so in a market like that, you have a lot of market power to extract high prices for your service. So I don't know that ending net neutrality really gives them a lot of scope to increase rates for customers all that much. Not really my policy area, so I'm happy to admit I could be wrong on that. You know, somebody more familiar with that, I would encourage to contribute and chat and let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody, so please do add. You know, this is meant to be more of a conversation than just me talking. So please feel free to point out when I say something stupid or wrong. I add this disclaimer every week, pretty much. I'm not an expert in a lot of the stuff I talk about. This is just things I know some things about. Some of it I know a lot about. It varies from topic to topic. So I encourage participation from people who know this, that, or the other fact that I miss or get wrong. But anyway, on net neutrality, a lot of the provisions people were concerned about were already legal, and I think customers are already getting milked for as much as they can be milked by a monopolistic industry. So probably they're looking more at getting more value from content creators, the Netflixes, etc. And they probably just want to charge them more, which, was going to happen sooner or later. I think we've talked about this before, and, my perspective on it, again, not really my area of expertise, but my perspective on it was that it was more of a lobbying battle between one industry against the other, against the content creating side of the internet versus the ISPs and the telecommunications industry. And, just given the nature of politics, it was inevitable that a Republican administration would eventually get voted into power and change net neutrality, those net neutrality provisions. So given that it was inevitable, I'm not that surprised that it happened, and now that it has, I don't know that there will be a significant change that would be noticeable by customers, per se. Maybe. It just depends on how far the telecommunications industry wants to go. It's quite possible they overplay their hand, and I think they're prescient of that. If they overplay their hand, there could be a big political backlash that results in far more restrictions than existed under the old net neutrality provisions. So they'll be wary about that, and generally companies are better about doing that than political parties. Generally the Republican or Democratic parties, when they get into power, are an unexpectedly large share of power in the political system. Democrats in 2006 and Republicans to a degree now, they tend to overreach a bit and generate a backlash that kind of limits them. Limits what they can do, limits their window of power in which to take action. Companies are a bit smarter than that, so I don't think they'll do anything really dramatic very quickly. It could be they do something more dramatic over the medium to long term, kind of boiling a frog, that kind of approach. We'll implement dramatic changes slowly so that nobody really notices or takes significant action. That said, there's going to, at least eventually, be a Democratic administration voted into power sooner or later. I mean, it's going to happen. It's pretty much inevitable. And when that happens, they're almost certainly going to change the net neutrality provisions back to what they were before the recent change. So that's not really great because it's not good to whipsaw regulations around like that. The ideal solution would be for Congress to step in and, well, do its job and pass legislation that could settle this issue more or less once and for all, and kind of set out what the ground rules are for net neutrality, and for that matter, just giving a more exact definition for what it is. That would be a lot more helpful, even if it didn't favor the telecommunications industry. Having that certainty would allow them to better plan over the long term and better structure their business model accordingly, rather than having to kind of hedge their bets, not really knowing whether or not the FCC or FTC, as the case may be, will suddenly change their interpretation of this, that, or the other rule, and then having to kind of redistribute resources quickly in order to account for it.
There's a question in the chat that's kind of related to some discussion we've had on net neutrality. They're asking, why is net neutrality a thing in the first place? And we've discussed the difference between thinking about internet use as a commercial entity or as a utility. Are you trying to sell this for as much as you possibly can? Or is this something kind of like gas, heat, air conditioning, water that people just in general need to have to survive and to live life in the 21st century? Internet was clearly not vital before it was invented, but now it's so integrated with our lives that it, generally speaking, is more of something that people just need to have. And there isn't really a point in price gouging people much higher than the cost of laying the infrastructure. Because once internet infrastructure is down, sure, you have to do maintenance if something gets messed up here or there, but there isn't a ton of input for ISPs, as far as I understand, unless you're upgrading the technology there, like going from DSL to cable or cable to fiber or something like that. But pro-net neutrality stance means that you're saying that the internet is a utility, that everyone should be able to have at a reasonable price, against net neutrality is basically saying we should be able to squeeze as much green from people who are purchasing internet as possible, throttling internet, bandwidth limits, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. That's a good, accurate description. I think before 2015, the regulations were very ambiguous because a lot of the regulations pertinent to the internet were old and not designed for the internet. They were designed, I think, in the 1930s or 40s or something around there. So in 2015, the Obama administration implemented net neutrality provision. Well, I shouldn't even say the Obama administration. I should say the FCC, which is technically an independent agency responsible for regulating the telecommunications industry. And they defined ISPs and the service they provide as a utility. Before, it had technically been defined as an information service. And that basically is reflects the divide that Neuro just described, the discussion, the debate about whether it's a utility or if it's private property. And the utility argument won the day from 2015 up until, what, a few days ago, basically, when they changed the interpretation back to that of an information service. And under the information service argument, interpretation, the ISPs own the infrastructure, and because it's their infrastructure, they can do with it what they like, which includes throttling data if they so chose. Again, it comes down to interpretation, and the reason interpretation is important here is because the laws are vague, which is why I say that Congress should clear it up. They could very easily pass legislation that would end this debate one way or the other. As is, the FCC, an administrative agency, has to figure out how these pre-existing laws apply here. And because they don't apply very well, because again, they're not designed for the internet, interpretation is very ambiguous and very subjective, and it kind of changes depending on the political winds, depending on who gets appointed to the FCC. Generally, the FCC is pretty good about trying to be objective, but when you get into a situation where there's ambiguity, like here, it becomes more politicized. It's open to more suggestion, basically. There is a argument to be made for, or rather, there is a good argument to be made against net neutrality, but it's not, whether or not it's for or against is irrelevant to the fact that it's just ambiguous. And it's the ambiguity that's not good from a regulatory standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a competitive standpoint, or from a political standpoint. It's all bad news, really. So let's see, there was, tell us what you think of the changes in Saudi Arabia, and what about Jerusalem? The prince purging family member, and how might it play out with Trump's Jerusalem shift? This is kind of two different things. The changes in Saudi Arabia we've talked about before, and that's basically the prince, I think his name is Mohammed bin Salman, Prince bin Salman, consolidating power. Previously, basically power had, succession from one king to the next was passed from brother to brother. That was done after the first king died. But now they're kind of running out of brothers, they're kind of getting older, so there's some question as to who comes next. And rather than leaving that process ambiguous, the current king has decided, all right, well, it's going to be my son, and he's just going to be king going forward for the next 40 years. Basically, that's what he's trying to do. And so he's paved the way by not quite repressing, but pushing out other parts of the Saudi royal family. The Saudi royal family has a lot of parts. It has 10,000 members in it. But he's going out of his way to eliminate all of the significant rivals. And when I say eliminate, I don't mean kill, just marginalize. And centralizing power with himself, the king, and his son, Mohammed bin Salman. And bin Salman has a lot of hats now as a result. He's interior minister, he's responsible for economic reform, he has all of these positions in the Saudi government. So basically the changes in Saudi Arabia recently have been a power play on the part of this one particular faction of the Saudi royal family to enshrine, so to speak, their rule. And it's suspected that the current king will abdicate relatively soon, and that the Prince Salman, will be made king at a relatively young age. He's only, I think, 31 right now. And if he becomes king within the next 10 years, he'll be one of the youngest kings, in fact, probably the youngest king Saudi Arabia has ever had. And given that kings in Saudi Arabia rule until death, I don't think there's any examples of any that haven't. That means he's going to be king for a long time. Assuming he lives until he's 80 years old, that's a 40-year reign, which is a significant period of time. I don't think any king of Saudi Arabia has ruled for more than, 10, 15 years since Saudi Arabia got started back in the 1920s. So that's a power play. In short, I've described this in more detail before, but without getting into that too much, that's basically what it is, a power play. And what about Jerusalem? So with Jerusalem, the United States recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This was contested even by the United States before. The Israelis seized Israel in the, I want to say, the Six-Day War in 1967. And they pretty much immediately declared it their capital and moved their capital there. So it actually is their capital. There's no disputing that. I mean, de jure, it is the capital of Israel. But it's also claimed by the Palestinians. Their capital, they say, should be in East Jerusalem. And so that's led to some discussion about whether or not the city should be divided into East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, with the capital of the Palestinian territory, if it should become an independent state, in East Jerusalem, and then the Israelis could have West Jerusalem and their capital there. That's why the Israelis talk about having an undivided capital, an undivided Jerusalem. They don't want to do that plan. They think the whole city should be Israeli, and that the only capital there should be theirs, and that the Palestinians can have their respective capitals someplace else. So this dispute has been going on since '67, and it kind of ties into the overarching Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if somebody wants to go into that, we can, but for now I'll just stick to the specific aspect of the conflict. Basically, nobody, as far as I know, no significant players in international relations recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, because it's seen as occupied territory. Israel occupied a bunch of territory as a result of the '67 Six-Day War, and maybe also the Yom Kippur War. I don't think they took as much territory in that, though, if any. And so because they don't recognize the Israeli occupation of those lands and the annexation thereof, they say that it can't be their capital, and that trying to make it the capital makes peace more difficult. Because the sort of gold standard for peace negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians is a return to the pre-1967 borders. You'll see that come up a lot. That just means a return to the borders, to what the borders were before the Six-Day War happened. And probably they won't return to exactly the same borders, because there's been a lot of mitigating events, intervening events since then that would make that very difficult. But something very close to the 67 borders was probably what any eventual peace agreement will look like. But having the Israelis claiming Jerusalem as the capital makes that very difficult. It's a sticking point in the negotiations. And previously, the United States was on the side of the countries that did not recognize Jerusalem as the Israeli capital, and did not recognize the legitimacy of the Israeli occupation in the 1967 territories. I know occupation is controversial, but bear with me. I'm trying to describe this as impartially as possible. Basically, those lands that Israel took in '67, the United States had not recognized that as legal, and as far as I know, continues not to recognize it as legal. But the Trump administration has come out in the past week or two, or whenever it was, saying that they recognize Jerusalem as the capital, and that the U.S. Embassy would be moved to Jerusalem accordingly. And so why the Trump administration did that, not entirely sure. It's not quite clear what they're going for. I think we might have talked about this the last time we did this, but basically, it may be that the Trump administration just wants to fulfill a campaign promise. I think he did promise that at some point while he was running for president. I don't think it really serves a strategic purpose, and in fact, I think even the Israelis are probably not really gung-ho about it. I'm sure the Israeli government and a lot of people in Israel are happy about it, because they have wanted that recognition for some time. But it comes at a sensitive time. The timing is bad, basically. because the Israelis are kind of looking at getting involved in Syria because they don't want the Iranians to maintain a presence in Syria after the civil war ends. And it looks like the conflict is kind of drawing towards a conclusion, or at least to a new phase anyway. So the Israelis and the Saudis, for that matter, are both concerned about Iranian influence in Syria and the prospect of a permanent military presence for Iran in Syria. And the Israelis in particular don't want that because they have a border with Syria, and so they're afraid that the Iranian army, or more likely the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, will have troops there right on their border. They don't want that. So it's possible they could get involved in some fashion, or at least more involved than they have been in the past going forward. And on account of that, well, specifically, they want to work more with the Saudis to contain Iranian influence, and specifically, possibly, to eject it from Syria, or at least mitigate it in Syria. And so there's kind of a budding alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia, specifically vis-a-vis Iran. But this Jerusalem issue is controversial not only in Israel and Palestine, it's also very controversial in the wider Arab world. Most people in the Arab world side with the Palestinians in that dispute and do not want Jerusalem to be recognized as the capital of Israel. And so the United States coming out and giving that recognition right now when the Israelis are trying to maintain a sensitive alliance with Saudi Arabia, it doesn't really facilitate that. You know, it sort of forces the Saudis into a position where if they maintain the alliance and go forward with cultivating it with Israel, then they get heat from the larger Arab world and their own citizens, for that matter, for siding with the Israelis over the Palestinians. And given that Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy that already has issues with legitimacy with its own population, they're going to have to back off, at least publicly. They might continue with it privately, but publicly anyway, they're going to back off from that alliance. And on the other hand, if they don't, you know, if the Saudis back off from the alliance, the downside there is that they're not getting as much cooperation with Israel vis-a-vis Iran, which they do want. So probably they'll keep cooperating. I mean, practically speaking, they'll just do it clandestinely. That's the most likely outcome. But the whole thing just raises the political cost of doing that, of that cooperation, and the Israelis probably don't much appreciate that. They would probably have rathered it wait or be done more on the down low, or at least done low-key, in some low-key fashion, more so than what was done. But I don't think it's significant, really, in the grand scheme of the region's politics. I don't think most Arab countries, I think most Arab people care about the Palestine issue, but most Arab political powers and political leaders don't really give that much of a shit. It's not really a big priority for them. They have bigger fish to fry. They have problems with internal security and regional rivalries and economic development, and issues like that are more what they're concerned about. So, in that sense, not a big deal. It's not going to change the dynamic of how things are playing out there. Is the sound okay?
Yep, sounds great. It's been consistent so far.
Oh, awesome. You get paranoid about it after a while.
Yep. Your setup is pretty good. I don't know how fancy your mic is, but the audio quality is good, and there isn't really background noise wherever you are.
Cool. Let's see. So the prince purging family member and how it might play out with Trump's Jerusalem shit. So I don't think the power play in Saudi Arabia, the attempt by Prince bin Salman to consolidate power and implement his agenda of economic reform and a more muscular foreign policy, I don't think any of that is going to be affected much by Jerusalem, by this, you know, U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as the capital. Kind of like what I was saying before, they're going to keep pursuing that cooperation with Israel, but they'll just do it more quietly. That's the only significant takeaway there. You know, the Palestinian issue in much of the Arab world is more, it's kind of like a lot of social issues here in the United States. You know, they're made to be really important, but then when people actually sit down to do politics in Washington, they kind of get short shrift. They're not really a high priority. Generally, economic issues and national security issues get priority in politics, legislation, that sort of thing. And then social issues kind of come out more during elections and campaigns. They're sort of hot button issues that political parties use to mobilize support. But in terms of actual legislating, they kind of fall by the wayside. The Palestine issue is used in a similar fashion. It's used to bolster legitimacy and credibility, or to deflect criticism by Arab regimes in the Middle East and North Africa. But when they're actually given an opportunity to do something about Palestine, they generally don't. Generally, they just kind of sit on the sidelines. It's not a huge priority for them. Let's see. So then the next one was, what do you think of China returning to Confucianism by opening more Confucianist schools? I was actually reading an article in Foreign Policy magazine not too long ago about that, and the party apparently is getting a little bit concerned about it, so I don't know that it's going to last much longer. There's been a sort of shift towards, I guess what you could call spiritualism in China over the past few decades. We've talked a little bit about this before too, I think. There's a lot of uncertainty being created in China by all of the economic churn. You know, economic development comes with a lot of, destabilizing social effects. And one of the ways people are dealing with that is turning more to religion, be it Christianity, Islam, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, what have you. Basically, sort of the traditional big religions and philosophies in China have been getting more attention, more adherence, more donations, and schools have been opening up for people who want to kind of educate their children in that vein. But the party is not entirely comfortable with that, and it is, given that one of the trends in China over the past few years has been a growing state paranoia about civil society and a crackdown on forces independent of the Communist Party in China. It's likely that the party will mitigate the scope of that movement, basically. They'll probably keep allowing the emergence of new institutions, new religious institutions, but they won't be as free as they have been. And that might slow down their development. It might slow down the evangelization of the Chinese population towards, spiritual faiths of one sort or another over the medium to long term. So I don't know that it's a long-term trend, because there is that break on it. But on the other hand, that push factor, the social instability from economic development, that's going to continue. So it may be that the push factor overcomes the break, and that there is still that shift towards more religiosity, so to speak, in China, even in spite of the party's efforts to mitigate it. It just depends on which force is more powerful, and I don't know enough about the party and the momentum of religious conversion and religious popularity, the popularity of religion in China, to kind of give an accurate prediction about what direction that'll go in. But in terms of Confucianism specifically, I don't think Confucianism really has a huge edge over the other faiths that they're kind of competing with. There's also a lot of Christians, a lot of Muslims, a lot of Buddhists, etc. So I haven't read anywhere anyway, and maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't read anywhere that Confucianism in particular is kind of taking off much more than the others, and that China in the future is going to be a Confucian society. As I understand it, it's just one of multiple faiths that are gaining significant numbers of adherents. And if it did, let's assume for a moment that it was becoming the leading religious force, or philosophical force, as it were, in China, and that it became dominant. If that trend were to emerge, the party would probably act on it significantly. The party would try to curb it significantly, or curtail it, or co-opt it. For now, I think the fact that the party has not significantly cracked down on it is evidence that it probably is not the leading, religious force in China. Again, could be wrong, but that's my understanding anyway. What political pressure got China to announce the future ban of ivory? Is it legit or just for show? Yeah, there's kind of a lot of nouveau riche people in China. I can't remember the Chinese term for them, but there's a lot of people who kind of grew up poor and now have a lot of money, and those people tend to buy things that are flashy, conspicuous consumption, that kind of thing. And one of the things they buy is a lot of things that are considered sort of, what would you call it, traditional Chinese medicine type stuff. Ivory and I think other type things are associated with male virility, and so if you have problems with male virility, then some people believe that if you take this, that, or the other item, then you can kind of deal with it that way, and that's a artifact of traditional Chinese medicine, and that's been one of the driving forces behind a lot of the demand in China for endangered species. Animals that you can harvest ivory from being the example here, but also there's this weird animal from Palawan in the Philippines that they have a taste for. I don't remember what it's called, but it's some weird armadillo-looking thing. Yeah, I know, that's very scientific, right? But what force pushed them to do it? I don't think any force pushed them to do it. I think that it's partly diplomatic, because in a lot of African countries in particular are victims of poaching. And you know, if you're an African country, you derive a not insignificant amount of revenue from tourism, for people coming to see the wildlife. And also you derive revenue from hunting licenses, allowing people to come and hunt certain animals. And poachers endanger that model. And so African countries have kind of asked, to a degree, well, let me put it like this. They may have asked the Chinese government to act on the poaching problem on their behalf, and so that may have led the Chinese government, out of sheer diplomacy, to act in order to maintain relations with African nations. And I have to say may have, because I haven't read anything to that effect. I don't know that that's true. It may be that people in the Communist Party anyway have taken an interest in the issue, maybe want to adopt more of an environmentalist, sustainable type policy for the Chinese government and are acting in that manner, or maybe they're afraid there'll be a global backlash. I don't know exactly why, so that's the correct answer here. I don't know. But my best guess, such as it is they're doing it for diplomatic reasons, in order to help out African nations that they're cultivating strong ties with. They're trying to get to a point where they have strong diplomatic and political ties. The economic ties are already kind of there to a degree, but they want to leverage that into a stronger relationship in the future. And you know, killing all of their endangered wildlife doesn't really facilitate that. So that's my best answer. That's my impression, but it's not the answer. It's not the facts. I don't know. I don't even know if you could find out, because the Communist Party of China isn't exactly transparent about such things. So, you know, who knows? But maybe they've released a statement somewhere at some point where they kind of detail their reasoning. And having not read such a statement, I kind of have to resort to guesswork. Let's see. What do you think about the ideological idea that the end goal of humanity is to make it so nobody ever has to work again? Oh, that's a broad question. That's a big thinker question.
That sounds like more of a kind of philosophical question than an economic or world history one.
Yeah. Let's see. Ideological idea that the end goal is to make it so nobody ever has to work again. I don't have a problem with it.
I feel like it creates the next step, which is the human existential struggle, and how that, by not working, sometimes that increases that problem. Because meaning and purpose a lot of times can be linked with your profession or your vocation. But if you no longer have to work, what do you do? Do you just watch TV all the time? Do you play video games all day? Certainly some people will be happy doing that. But a lot of people are kind of deeply troubled if they feel like they're not making progress on some front or building something of value, of lasting value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's especially, I imagine it would especially be a problem in Anglo-Saxon societies like the UK, the United States, Australia, etc. Mm-hmm. Because work in those societies in particular has a prestige associated with it. You know, if you have a job, then that's considered better than having no job, whatever kind of job you may have. Mm-hmm. And people get real sensitive about things like welfare or some other equivalent because they think it's rewarding people for not working. And that triggers people a lot more here than it does elsewhere. Mm. But the ideological idea, I don't know. I mean, I've said it before, so I'll say it again here. I mean, the outcomes on these sort of big technological trends and the effect they'll have on society, etc., outcomes and how societies deal with them are going to vary significantly from society to society. It'll depend a lot on individual cultures and individuals in those cultures and economic interests and political preferences, etc. It's going to depend on a lot of different factors, and the result probably will be a lot of different policy, a lot of different policies intended to deal with it. And so you'll end up with a smorgasbord probably of different countries that have very different societies that reflect their different solutions to these kinds of questions. Let's see, what do you think about a guaranteed basic income, Milton Friedman, and explain how there can maybe be a conservative economics that appeals to those who fear rising economic inequality? It's a multi-part question. Let's see. What do I think about guaranteed basic income? It just depends on how you implement it. It's perfectly efficacious in theory, because you're giving people a basic income, and they can then, depending on your government, you could pull all other forms of welfare and social benefits after implementing a universal basic income on the argument that you have enough to survive, so now whatever happens is on you. That's kind of the libertarian perspective. You could also use it from a more leftist perspective that, this is your right. You should have your basic needs met, and then you should also have things like a social safety net, help with medical insurance, these kinds of things. So the effect that it has on society, for one, is uncertain, because it hasn't really been done before, at least not on a large enough scale for over a long enough period of time from which to extrapolate inferences. But whatever effect it has is going to depend on how you do it, because it depends on, do you give it to everybody, do you give it to certain groups in certain regions? I mean, Alaska kind of already has something like this, and they redistribute royalty payments from oil and gas extraction, I think. And so everybody in Alaska gets a check for some amount of money. I don't think it's a significant amount of money. It's probably not as much as what would be proposed under UBI, the Universal Basic Income, but that is kind of in that vein. But I haven't read enough about it to kind of give a detailed analysis. I guess I should have, since people keep asking about it, so I probably should just sit down and read a policy paper about it, some kind of white paper or lit review or something. But without having a better, deeper background with it, I can't give you a deeper analysis than that. As for Milton Friedman, yeah, he was if you don't know, he's an economist yeah, he's the economist. Thomas Friedman is the commentator, I think. Milton Friedman was an economist in the 1970s and 80s. He was well known for advocating for a free market, deregulation, etc., kind of a conservative economic approach to economic management. That's kind of how he's known in the policy sphere. In the actual field of economics, he's known for monetarism, which was a theory, basically, that the economic performance is defined by interest rates and money supply. And he wrote his big accomplishment was a book called The Monetary History of the United States. I'm sure he wrote lots of other stuff too, but the big one that I remember reading about was Monetary History of the United States, in which he detailed basically the economic history of the United States from the perspective of money supply, basically how money supply impacted the development of the U.S. economy from its inception up to what was then the present, up until I guess the early 1980s. I think he's still alive, actually, come to think of it. I think he might actually still be around. He's an older guy, though. He must be in his 80s by now if he is still alive. But yeah, I mean, Milton Friedman is kind of a standard bearer for sort of conservative free market economics, or more accurately, conservative free market economic policies. I should emphasize that, not necessarily the economics. And I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. I mean, he's a thinker. He's contributed to the field, and you respect him for that. But I haven't ever done like a deep analysis of Milton Friedman. Like I'm not a Friedman follower, I guess, because I know that certain economists and economic philosophies have their sort of groupies almost. I don't do any of that really. I'm familiar with his work, some of his theory, but beyond that, I don't have like a pro or con opinion on him. Explain how there can how there can maybe be a conservative economics that appeals to those who fear rising economic inequality. Well, the UBI argument is the libertarian approach. That was basically what I just described. That's pulling social benefits in exchange for just a universal basic income that just gives people what they need, and then you can kind of wash your hands of them. That's one approach. Another approach, well, this is conservative economics, again, economic policy that appeals to those who fear rising inequality. I mean, the thing about conservative economic policy, such as it is in the United States, that's basically shorthand for free market solutions. Some would criticize it as being corporatism, but that's a whole other discussion we could get into. But basically, yeah, there is a free market argument to be had for how you manage an economy and the policies you design to maintain it. And I don't know that there's really a good way to do that that really addresses the fears of people who are concerned about economic inequality. Or, I mean, even more broadly, just people who are being left behind. With economic development and economic changes, in particular the changes we're experiencing right now in the economy, a lot of people are left out. They don't get as much of the gains that are being generated. And for them, you almost kind of can't sell it to them, in a sense, because having those people be left out is just an innate part of the system. Like, if you're going to have a free market, you're invariably going to have a lot of inequality as different actors perform at different levels and succeed in varying degrees. So having a large chunk of people get left out and kind of get run over by economic changes is just innately a part of that perspective. And it's kind of just the cost of doing business, so to speak. And I mean, you can kind of ameliorate a little bit by pointing out that their children will do better, probably, because their children are not the ones being disrupted. If you've worked in a factory for 20 years and thought you were going to retire there and then suddenly find out you have to change careers, it's a big problem for you to have, a free market competition type economic system. But for your kids, for them, they can see where the jobs will be in the future. They're not going to go work in your factory. They're going to see it struggling. They're going to see it close down, and they're going to gravitate towards other professions. And because they're younger, they can focus on learning those skills in high school or college or wherever. So they're not in as much of a hole as somebody who's invested a lot of their life learning one set of skills and maybe are not well prepared to make a transition. Children are more flexible in that regard. So in the long term, the economy will be better off, and you won't have as many people kind of getting getting caught up in the churn of the economic transition caused by technological innovation, etc. Hypothetically, at some point in the future, we will reach a new equilibrium in which the new economy kind of emerges and the opportunities become apparent, and we can kind of order society accordingly and reach a more stable sort of status quo than what we have right now. Maybe technological innovation just never slows down and there's a constant churn. That presents a whole other set of problems. But for now, that people who suffer from that churn are kind of the short-term cost that you have to trade in order to get the long-term gain of a more efficient economy that's more prosperous and is kind of maximizing the gains and economic growth and the gains that you get thereof. Now, there's also people who are just, there's the argument that you make where there's just a larger underclass. If you have a free market society, maybe it's just that you innately have a very large portion of the population that struggles to get by and is just sort of a permanently poor working class. It's harder to see in the United States because we're a bit wealthier and better off, but you see it more kind of in places like Latin America. You kind of saw it in Russia in the 90s, although that's a debatable case. So for those people, it's also a hard sell. That just gets back to the old labor capital divide. I mean, invariably, there's going to be tension between the people who own the means of production and the people who work the means of production. That might change in the future as you maybe don't need people to work the means of production. Maybe you get robots to do that. Or maybe the capital is such that the capital itself has intelligence and works by itself. But that's medium to long term. Over the short term, how would you sell free market economics to, free market economic policies to people who are kind of in that working class and who don't benefit as much from that system? Maybe you don't. Maybe you could argue sort of a broad-minded philosophical sort of approach where you're arguing that, this economic system generates the most gains over the long term generates the most advances, generates the most leaps forward in medicine and technology, and you benefit from those. But on the other hand, you know, the inevitable counterargument is that if you're poor, you don't have access to as much of those, and over the long, well, as the old saying goes, over the long term, you're dead. So by the time those innovations come, you may be too old to really benefit from them significantly. So, and then you may not even be able to afford them, depending on how the, you know, how the medical insurance system works, or how, you know, just how the economy is structured. It may be that you're on the outside looking in. So there is no good argument to be made there, maybe. And I don't know how to construct one. And that's not because there isn't one, that's just because I'm not familiar with it. I haven't really invested a lot of time in figuring out how to proselytize people to a free market perspective, or to a socialist perspective, or to whatever perspective. Basically, in the free market of ideas, whichever idea just is the most competitive will win out, and that's how policy is structured. That's more my perspective. But how to push one particular perspective, I don't know. I would have to think a lot more about it in order to construct a good argument there, a good position.
Oh, it's all about appeal to emotion, dude. Come on.
Well, we've had plenty of that in American politics over the past 2 decades.
Riled up.
We've had plenty of that, and I don't know that it's helped all that much. I mean, the result hasn't been one ideology really winning over the other. It's been more of a kind of World War I style stalemate, where there are some gains now and again, but then they're reversed later, and then those are reversed later, and it's back and forth, and constant conflict without significant momentum one way or the other. And I think it would be better to return to, if it ever existed anyway, to return to a more civilized discourse in which it's recognized that it's better just to compromise and move forward than it is to just constantly fight over the same issues and never make any progress. That requires a certain political maturity on the part of political actors, as well as voters, to accept that there are some things that they can't have, and that those things should be sacrificed for the greater good, so to speak, the greater stability of the political system. But we're not quite there yet, I don't think. I think a lot more people became politically involved with the onset of the internet and internet culture, but that a lot of those people don't really comprehend fully, or didn't comprehend fully, the compromises that are necessary, or the extent of the compromises necessary to make a political system function. And that we're kind of in a intermediate stage between the time when people don't understand that and when people do understand that and are willing to make those compromises. We're in that transition period, and it looks messy. But until we kind of get to a point where the broader public comprehends that, the necessity of compromise to political stability and outcomes and prosperity, for that matter, it's probably just going to keep going. So I don't proselytize much on that account. I don't see a lot of logic in it. It's not really going to go anywhere. And the people who you think you proselytize actually don't really believe. You haven't actually successfully proselytized them. Generally, you just convince them on a minor point, and then they'll change later as they learn more about it, and then change again later. And you know, there's no deeper you can't really proselytize somebody who doesn't understand the broader issue. You know, you can't. That's not really possible. They'll just change later on. They don't fully understand it anyway, so it's not a. You need a kind of engaged citizenry that has a broader understanding, not a perfect understanding. That's not possible, but who has a broader understanding of the issues at hand. And again, we're just not quite there yet. But yeah, I don't know how to make that sort of right-wing free market perspective appeal more to people who suffer, people who are kind of the losers from that, people who are maybe do not benefit as much, or maybe even are hurt by that particular system. I mean, it's a question that's been asked before, and nobody's ever really been able to come up with a good answer. I mean, politics in America anyway is defined by the inability to really sell the free market economy to the workers, and the workers are constantly pushing for more social benefits, more rights, you know, a more even playing field between them and the powers that be, you know, the owners of capital. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. There's just too much of there's too much divergence in the interests between them for there to ever really be a good long-term equilibrium there. I mean, the closest you could get is something like Germany, where labor and capital kind of have a culture of working together. That's sort of an established political custom in Germany, that you don't rock the boat too much. You know, if you have a problem, you come and discuss it You have political actors and you have capital and labor. They all get together and they reach a consensus and then they implement policy. That's just how it's done there. And everybody accepts that that's the way it should be done and that it's a good norm to have and maintain. And it's propagated on that count. Here in the United States, we don't have that. We have a much more adversarial, confrontational relationship between labor and capital. And that's partly an artifact of our culture, not even just political culture. Again, hard work and individualism is sort of the prime mover in American culture. It's a significant feature of American culture. And as a result, the politics kind of reflects that in that antagonism between labor and capital. Capital says labor is lazy and shouldn't have so many benefits. And then labor says that that's unfair and that they should have these benefits and that they still would work hard if they had them, etc. And it just kind of plays out ad infinitum over time. Maybe they'll change someday with demographic changes, but I doubt it. I'm skeptical on that count.
It was Kukio who said, in America, with the capitalism we have, either you're a millionaire or you're a temporarily embarrassed future millionaire.
Yeah.
That's all we have here. Because the system is free and open, and everyone is great, therefore everyone is going to be successful. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of maybe not quite a universally accepted norm here, but it's a widely held belief in the United States that if you work hard enough, you can make it. Maybe you can't be super rich, but you can be well off if you just work hard enough. And that's a belief even held by the working classes here. And you can argue that it's naive, but it's you can't be denied that it's an immensely useful it's a very useful social norm to have. I mean, it encourages people to be entrepreneurial, for one. Again, maybe not entirely reasonable, but it does encourage them to do it. And there is more entrepreneurship in the United States than in other peer countries and cultures. There's more here than even in Europe, really. And that also kind of addresses this question. How do you sell the free market to the working class, so to speak, people concerned about inequality? And part of the way you do that is just culture. It may be that you can change the culture such that people accept that there will be losers from a free market system as the cost of doing business. If they accept that, if they internalize that as a kind of as being something that should be done for the greater good, then you could have acceptance by a broader part of the population that a free market economic system is a good idea. To a degree, that's what we've done in the United States, and it's one of the reasons capitalism has continued as unvarnished as it has over the past century, even in the face of significant challenges from sundry other ideologies and philosophies. There's this cultural acceptance that competition and capitalism innately lends itself to some inequality and some losers, and that this is an acceptable cost to gain the benefits of a free market system. So that's kind of how we do it here. But even that is not a perfect answer, because obviously there are still a lot of people who want reform, who are not who are not comfortable with the free market system or the free market system that we have here in the United States. No country has a perfect free market system. They're all mixed economies, so you can't really say the United States or some other country has a capitalist system. But the United States is generally recognized as having more of a free market system than most any other country, probably more than any other developed country anyway. I think Singapore and Hong Kong sometimes rank higher, depending on who you talk to. But regardless, yeah, culture is definitely how we maintain it here, but not a perfect answer. And I don't know how you get the doubters. How do you convert the doubters that are in the United States?
By a really catchy chant that you get the crowd to do.
Oh, yeah, slogans help. I don't know. We might be past the point of political history where you can kind of do that, though. That was more 20th century. I think now you'd need a meme or something. So let's see. So that's kind of a rough answer to this question. It's kind of a multi-part question, and if I haven't adequately addressed the crux of the question here, but this person should feel free to elaborate and ask again, so I can kind of home in on more on what he wanted me to get to. I hope I answered the question adequately anyway, and I apologize if not. Let's see. Did you see today's story in Politico about Project Cassandra and the U.S. looking into Hezbollah's various illegal activities and how those investigations were thwarted by Obama's desire to get a nuclear deal done with Iran? If so, was the nuclear deal worth scrapping all that work on Hezbollah? No, I didn't see that Politico article, so I can't comment on it much. I'll open up a tab here in my browser so I can look it up, because that does sound interesting. Let's see, Politico, Iran, yeah, get to that later. But I think I might have read something. Was this the Argentina thing? Let me see here. Project Cassandra and the U.S. Well, for those unfamiliar with this issue, basically the Obama administration pushed hard for a nuclear deal with Iran, the deal that was meant to constrain Iran's program to develop a nuclear weapon. And an immense amount of pressure was brought on Iran in terms of economic sanctions implemented by a range of countries in order to pressure them into making such a deal. But the criticism of, excuse me, the criticism of the Obama administration at the time was that they were too eager to have a deal, that they were so eager to have a deal that they were actually losing leverage in the negotiation. You know, if you think the other guy wants a deal more than you, then you get a little bit of leverage, and there was a sense that the Obama administration was signaling too much eagerness in the negotiation. And one of the further criticisms, kind of an extension of that, is that the United States was willing to overlook, if not exclude, the regional rivalry with Iran and the security issues that Iran and its activities in the region arose in order to just focus on the nuclear deal. In other words, it was thought that there should be, the criticism was that the nuclear deal should have had a component to it that involved restricting Iran's activities in the region, in addition to putting restrictions on its nuclear weapon program. But the Obama administration didn't do that. It seems, from what's publicly known currently anyway, that the Obama administration segregated the regional rivalry, you know, Iran's activities in the region vis-a-vis supporting Hezbollah and Syria, etc. Those were ignored to just focus specifically on the nuclear weapon issue. And so I hadn't heard about this Project Cassandra thing, but that seems to be in the vein of that criticism that the United States did not do enough to focus on the broader ambit of the issues that Iran poses to the United States in the region beyond just the nuclear weapon. It may be that the administration thought that a nuclear weapon was a significant enough issue to negotiate in and of itself and to focus on in and of itself without complicating it with other issues. That's debatable. You could go either way on that. But without getting into that debate and without knowing specifically about this article on Project Cassandra, I couldn't go into it much more than that. If so, was the nuclear deal worth scrapping all that work on about? Again, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of subjective. You know, the whole Iran deal has sparked a lot of controversy in the foreign policy community. You know, there were some people who thought it was worth it to get Iran to dedicate itself to the provisions of the deal to restrict its nuclear program. Other people thought that the provisions in the deal were not strict enough to prevent the deal, and some people say that they're probably still working on it. And then other people thought that the idea of a deal was stupid, that the United States should have used more coercion to force them to a more strict deal, if not a broader deal that limited Iranian activity in the region. Again, in terms of supporting Syria and Hezbollah, there should have been restrictions placed on such support and other dubious Iranian. You know, Iran has its claws pretty deep in a lot of the politics in the region, so there's plenty of things that you could have brought up in the deal and asked them to refrain from doing. But it's kind of subjective. It just depends on how much you trust the Iranian regime and how important you think the nuclear weapons issue was relative to the other issues. I mean, maybe if you're just as concerned about Iranian influence spreading in the region as you are about an Iranian nuclear weapon, probably makes a lot of sense then to include all of those in the same negotiation. But if you're significantly more concerned about a nuclear weapon than you are about Iran's regional ambitions, then in that case it kind of does make sense just to focus on the nuclear weapon in the deal. So in that sense, you would think it would be worth it. Again, it's subjective, so you kind of have to just judge for yourself. It just depends on your own preferences and perspective. As for Hezbollah, I'm not all that concerned about Hezbollah, really. Hezbollah generally stays in Lebanon. That's their principal area of operations. They've been accused of perpetrating violence outside of Lebanon, but it hasn't happened very much, and generally it's very targeted. Not that that's a good thing. Obviously, they shouldn't be targeting anybody. But in terms of the United States and national security here, Hezbollah is not like a big threat. It's not even really a big threat to Israel. The worst they can do is lob a few hundred rockets at Israel. And that can cause a lot of damage and kill a number of people, but it would hardly be existential. And I'm pretty sure the Israelis could deal with that if they wanted to, probably in dramatic fashion. So Hezbollah is not like a big loss in that sense. And whatever traction they had on going after them. I should probably read the article before commenting too much on that, though. So I'll stop there. Stop while I'm ahead. Cut my losses. Let's see. So in regards to the Alabama Senate race, thoughts in general. What's the Republican Party planning to do about the loss of the seat? Does the loss of that seat change Senate lawmaking? Maybe. I don't know that it really would about anything substantive, though. Because it was not a battle between the left and right in Alabama. It was a battle between the far right and the center right. The left was never going to win that seat, and it hasn't. I think his name is Doug Jones, the Democrat who won the election there. He's not a progressive guy. He has some beliefs that are somewhat progressive, but, it's Alabama. You're not going to win a seat there if you're not conservative in a lot of ways. So I don't see it as like a big win for the progressive left. It's more just the center right defeating the far right and preventing, what's his name, Roy Moore, from picking up the seat. And, again, that's not necessarily a big defeat either for the populist right, because they're still there. What's happened is not the marginalization of the populist right, it's more just a temporary reprieve. Because if the center right, in the form of Doug Jones in this case, does not deliver and makes one wrong move, then he's out. And the populist right will get their guy in. Because Doug Jones only won by 1%? 1.5%? It was a very narrow margin. So it wasn't even a crushing victory on the part of the center right over the far right. It was very close. So I don't think it'll have a big impact on legislation, because I don't think he'll always hew with the Democratic Party. The Democrats don't vote as a party like you would in a parliamentary system. Well, neither party does that. It's not like a parliamentary system where you really need to vote as a party, and if you don't, there's severe punishment. Here in the United States, you kind of vote how you want to. Generally, you vote with your party because they'll give you goodies, they'll help you with campaign financing, and if you're politically weak, they might threaten you with a primary challenge. But in general, if you're relatively strong, then you can kind of tell the party to, buzz off and kind of do what you want. Something like this happened back in 2010, I think, when the Obamacare legislation, the Affordable Care Act, was being negotiated. They negotiated a settlement, and well, maybe not a settlement, but a bill was negotiated and voted on, and they thought they had the votes for it. But Ted Kennedy died. He had brain cancer, and he died. He was a senator from Massachusetts, and so there was a special election had, and it was assumed that a Democrat would pick up the seat. But there was so much heat and controversy being generated by the Affordable Care Act that a Republican actually won the seat. It was a big upset. Everybody was surprised by it. I think his name was Scott Hannon. He was some kind of male model or something. And he actually, well, the bill was renegotiated. It ended up being less. There were a lot of compromises made, and that's how the Affordable Care Act, as it exists now, was passed. The original incarnation had, I think, more state intervention and whatnot. Basically, they just had to make it less of a leftist bill. They made it was less appealing to leftists and somewhat more appealing to rightists or conservatives or whatever you want to call them. And Hannon actually did vote for the Affordable Care Act in its renegotiated form. So if you're a Republican and you wanted to just stop socialized medicine, as you think of it, having Scott Hannon vote for the Affordable Care Act would have been very disappointing. But most people in Massachusetts are relatively left. In terms of American politics, anyway, they're relatively leftist. So even though a Republican won the seat, he was on the left wing of the Republican Party. He was sort of, in the grand scheme of conservative politics, he was on much closer to the left than almost anybody else. And he voted accordingly. And, that just reflects the constituency. And I guess that's the point I'm getting to here. In the same way that Scott Hannon reflected the leftist preferences of his constituency, even though he was a Republican, Doug Jones in Alabama is going to reflect the conservative hue of politics in Alabama and vote accordingly. He's not going to vote straight Republican all the time, in the same way that, or straight Democrat all the time, in the same way that Scott Hannon did not vote straight Republican all the time. It's more about the constituency than it is about party politics. That's one of the saving graces of the electoral system here. And it's one of the things that I think we have an advantage over party politics in a parliamentary system. Because a parliamentary system is very unforgiving for rebels. I think there was a big rebellion just recently in the United Kingdom over a Brexit bill. There was a bill that they wanted to fix the date of Brexit, I think. Maybe it was something else, I don't remember exactly. But the point is, the Tories were supposed to vote for it, because that was Prime Minister May had kind of thrown her support behind it, and it was a sort of a Tory legislation. But there was a big rebellion of Tory legislators, and the bill ended up getting defeated. And I think it was the first major legislative defeat for the May government. And people were punished for that. I think the guy who kind of led that effort on the part of the rebels ended up losing his position in the parliament. I don't think he lost his seat. I don't think they have that much power, but he ended up being sort of he ended up punished in some fashion, however it is you do that. And he was like a assistant something or other, and they removed him from that post. That doesn't happen as much in the United States. You can be punished in a way. They can remove you from a critical committee or some such thing in Congress if you kind of piss the wrong people off. But if you want to be a maverick, it's much less costly in the American electoral system than it is in a parliamentary system like in the UK. And that's not quite the same as the representative, a proportional voting system like in Germany or France. That's a whole other conversation. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. The original question was the Alabama Senate race. Thoughts in general, probably not a big change. It was kind of a defeat for the populist right, but not a significant defeat. They're still there, and they could easily pick up the seat again later on in a few years. In terms of affecting legislation, I don't think Doug Jones is going to just vote always Democrat. He probably will defect for certain bills, depending on their context. So it's not like the progressive left is dealing a huge blow to the right here in general. He's still probably a conservative, and will support generally conservative legislation. It's kind of a jarbled answer. I apologize, but that's what I've got off the top of my head anyway. Hopefully, I addressed this. I hope I've addressed the question adequately in that, as far as what he wanted me to get at.
The statistic that I saw about the election that a lot of people were talking about on Twitter and stuff was the black vote in Alabama. I think black women voted something like 99% against Roy Moore, and black men it was something like 96%. So that was a very unanimous demographic for where the votes were going.
Yeah, that's not unusual, though. African Americans in the South generally vote pretty much as a block for Democrats. Generally, the percentage for Democrats is very high. What was new here with this special election was turnout. The African American turnout was much higher than usual. Normally, they don't have enough numbers to kind of throw a race one way or the other, but in this one they did. And the other side of that coin is the low turnout amongst center-right conservatives, moderate Republicans, if you will. If it had just been high African-American turnout, but not low Republican turnout, or at least relatively low Republican turnout, Roy Moore probably would have still won. But both of them together, the low Republican turnout and the high African-American turnout together, was kind of enough to do it. And again, it was just barely. It was a very thin margin. It was only 1% or so. So it was still very close. But as far as African American women kind of winning the election for them, to a degree, but they always vote that way, so it seems weird to kind of give them credit for voting the way they always do. And I think even some African American activists were complaining about it, like, why? What are you doing?
Yeah, but to vote, you have to go outside. And who wants to do that? You know.
Well, I think their thing was more unfairly kind of putting a burden on African Americans, like they should be the savior, and then kind of rewarding them for being the savior. It's not their job to be the savior, was the criticism.
I see.
And so they shouldn't have that burden put on them to come out and save the day. You know, it should be about the politics, not about the rat race, so to speak. So let's see. There were reports that Trump's tax plan would alter the 401k annual limit to $2,600. Due to outcries, this was dropped, but this question remains: what was the reasoning behind this? I don't know the reasoning behind why it was dropped, so if you're asking that, I can't help you. I wasn't there, and I haven't read anything kind of delving into it. But probably they just dropped it because it would have been very unpopular. You know, 401ks are important to people who are relatively well off and who are working, and those people are more, well, I shouldn't say working, but upper middle class people to upper class type workers. They lean on their 401k. They actually use it. There are people who are working class who use it, but there's a disproportionate number of them who probably don't even know it exists. I was one of them at one point. But because those voters, that upper middle class, upper class bracket, leans on the 401k, does enjoy it, and that those people generally vote more Republican, they were probably afraid of pissing those people off, and so took it out on that account. That would be my guess. But it's just that, a guess. I could easily be wrong. They took out a bunch of stuff. In fact, maybe this is just a good opportunity to kind of talk about it a little bit, because I had it in my notes here. Yeah, the House and Senate had two different versions of this tax bill, and they reconciled them. And so we do have a final bill that will be voted on. And from what it sounds like, from what I've read, it looks like it probably will be passed. Some of the people who were kind of on the fence have been brought around through some of the changes. The corporate tax rate is going to be reduced significantly. It had been, I think, 35%. And now it's going to go down to 21%. That's 1% higher than they wanted it. They had been gunning for 20%. But they goosed it a little bit to deal with the deficit problem. We talked a little bit about the deficit issue before. They have to... a bill, in order to get a simple majority vote in the Senate, a given bill cannot add to the deficit, cannot add more than $1.5 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. And it can't add anything to the deficit after 10 years. So in order to reduce the cost of the bill, they reduced the decrease in the corporate income tax to 21%. 1% isn't a whole lot, but it does generate some revenue, and they did a lot of things like that to try to come up with the revenue to pay for it. They did end up dropping the income tax for the top income bracket from 39.6% to 37%, which surprised me because I don't think the House version had that, and it seemed like a bold move given that you're already going to get a lot of shit politically for focusing on an income tax for a tax cut for corporations. Having a tax cut for the top income bracket in addition to that, that's really pushing your luck. But they saw fit to push it, and apparently they have the vote, so that's going to happen. But they may have to pay for that later. That seems like a bridge too far to me. But that's also in the bill. It also added significantly to the cost, which just makes the whole thing more difficult to do as far as the controlling for the deficits. It's going to, yeah, we already know that. Tax deduction for state income property taxes. They were talking about removing entirely the tax deduction for state income taxes, but instead they've capped it. So it's still there, but now it's capped at $10,000, so you can't deduct more than $10,000 for your state income tax and property taxes. And for a lot of working class and lower middle class people, that's kind of a kiss to them. That helps them out. They probably won't have to pay much, if any, extra because they put in that cap instead of removing it entirely. It's a bit of an issue if you're a high income earner. You're probably not going to like that because you'll have to pay out probably a lot more. But you can probably afford it, and if you're a high income earner, you may well benefit from the maybe directly or indirectly from the corporate income tax cut or from the cut to pass-through entities. think we talked a little bit about pass-through entities before. Basically, if you own your own business, but you're not a corporation, you can kind of qualify as a pass-through entity. Basically, it's where you have a business where the income goes directly to you personally. You don't technically own it per se. As an individual business, it is technically a corporate entity, but all of the income goes directly to you, as opposed to shareholders or to the corporation itself. Technically, corporations are people according to U.S. law. That's a whole other conversation. But pass-through entities are that, and they got a tax cut. Let's see, and then the individual health insurance mandate is going to be effectively removed. That probably isn't going to end well, but they're not going to remove it. What they're going to do is they're going to set the penalty for not having health insurance to $0. So technically there is still a penalty for not having health insurance, but you don't have to pay anything for the penalty, so effectively it's gone. That's a problem because, you know, part of the way that for the compromise with the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare was that revenue would be generated for the health insurance industry to pay for the removal of basically, if you were a health insurance industry before the Affordable Care Act, you could deny people coverage based on pre-existing conditions. So if they were sick and they came to you and asked for insurance, you could say no. The Affordable Care Act banned that, but of course that introduces a significant source of new costs for the health insurance industry. And the compromise was the healthcare mandate. You know, if you have to have healthcare, and the idea was to get a lot of people who were healthy, who would not otherwise have health insurance, to pay into the system, so that the health insurance industry could have enough revenue to pay for all these people with pre-existing conditions who were coming into the system. Effectively, it was a tax. That's actually how the Obama administration argued it before the Supreme Court. There was a legitimate constitutional question about whether or not you could force people to have health care. And the answer to that is no, the government cannot require you to have health care or insurance of any kind or some other service, but it can tax you for not having it. You know, the power to tax is the power to destroy. You know, that line of reasoning. And so technically it's a tax, and the Supreme Court gave it a pass on those grounds. But by removing that mandate, you're removing a lot of revenue from the health insurance industry, and you're making it even harder for the health insurance industry to pay for people with pre-existing conditions. And there was already a problem in the system with people, not enough people buying insurance. A lot of people were actually just paying the penalty for not having health insurance rather than paying for some because it was cheaper, because premiums kind of went up. Again, that's, you know, the state of healthcare in the United States is a debate and discussion in and of itself. But suffice to say, removing the healthcare mandate compounds pre-existing problems with Obamacare and the insurance industry, the health insurance industry. And the health insurance industry was dead set against removing it. You know, they're all for reform and changing the system. I'm sure they would be happy with the free market system. But given that they're working within the rubric of Obamacare, removing the healthcare mandate just deals them a big blow. It just hurts them a lot. And I think it's being done more for political reasons here. You know, the Republican Party has been promising to get rid of Obamacare and replace it for a long time. And one of the most offensive aspects of Obamacare from the start to Republicans and conservatives was the mandate. The idea that the government should tax you for not having a service was really antagonized a lot of people who felt that that was well beyond the remit of the federal government. So it's no surprise that they're targeting it, but I kind of wish that if they were going to remove it, they would do a broader reform effort that addresses broader problems in the healthcare industry, certainly for health insurance companies. As is, they're just kind of taking out, you know, one minor problem, one minor aspect of Obamacare without dealing with the consequences of removing it. It's just exacerbating a pre-existing problem. So it's not a particularly smart thing to do policy-wise. It's not good policy making. And so I'm critical of it on that count. If they wanted to do it, they should have done it when they were trying to reform the whole Obamacare package, you know, a few months ago. That was more the time to do it. By trying to shoehorn this in here, you're just kind of shooting for minor political points. And in exchange, you're getting a massive problem for the insurance industry. there is some logic that you could make the situation so bad that you have to revert to a free market system, that you have to repeal Obamacare, that it's the only solution given the collapse of the healthcare industry. Well, the health insurance industry anyway. I mean, because the health insurance industry is definitely suffering. You know, there are a lot of contradictions and problems with Obamacare that haven't ever really been worked out, and this will exacerbate them and maybe push the industry to the edge, such that there is a need to push for a free market system, or a repeal of Obamacare anyway. Whether you're for or against Obamacare, whether you're for or against a free market healthcare system, that's a really irresponsible way to make policy, though, to think about policy. That kind of strategic politicking, trying to make something so bad that people have to default to something else. It's very disrespectful to political opponents, and it generally leads to very destructive policies. You know, if there's a bad policy, don't make it worse so that you can get your way. Fix it. That's the responsible thing to do in a political system. But the political culture in the United States is not particularly healthy, and so there's a lot of that kind of logic being used. There's a lot of that kind of strategic legislating, I guess you could call it. I don't particularly approve of it, but my opinion doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The point is, they're getting rid of it, and it's going to compound problems in the health insurance sector. They're eliminating personal exemptions. That's just part. There's going to be a higher standard deduction, but personal exemptions will be removed. And the idea there is to just make the whole process of filing your taxes simpler. And that, of course, was one of the big selling points of the tax bill. Let's just make it easier for people to file the taxes, so it isn't the big ordeal that you do every year. Make of that what you will. I mean, basically they even out, so there's not really a significant change in deductions there. Lowered the effective tax rate for pass-through entities. They fiddled with the medical expense deduction, not really significant, and they're going to phase it out in 2 years anyway. I thought it was interesting that they didn't do the grad student tuition waiver tax. That's off the table, so that wasn't in the final bill. That was a good move, I think. It would have generated very little revenue, and it would have pissed off so many people. So politically savvy to remove that. They compromised on the mortgage deduction. They'd been talking about removing the mortgage interest rate deduction for houses, for mortgages rather, worth more than $500,000 for the House version, and then $1 million for the Senate version. And so they compromised, and now it's going to be $750,000. So if your mortgage is more than $750,000, you're not going to be able to deduct. You're not going to be able to use the mortgage interest rate deduction anymore after they pass the bill. So it's probably going to get passed. Rubio and Corker have apparently been talked around to it, and those were some of the principal critics. So if they're going to vote for it, it probably will get passed. And you know, I don't know that the impact will be really great. It's not a particularly impactful bill economically. I don't know that corporations are really going to use the tax cut to invest a lot more, because there's not a lot to invest in. The global economy is recovering, so there is kind of more reason to invest. You might see an increased investment there, but I don't know that they will invest significantly more than they would have otherwise with the corporate income tax cut. So I don't think it'll really have a significant impact economically. It'll make them more competitive overseas, but if you're, you know, average working class American or middle class, you probably won't really feel this very much. I don't think. Unless you're in one of these, you know, unless you in particular benefited from some of these deductions or exemptions that are being modified or removed, you're probably not going to really notice it that much. I'm willing to admit I'd be wrong, because I haven't read too much into this. I haven't read a good analysis of this. I've just read this sort of in the articles and whatnot, so I'm open to criticism on that count. So the original question then was what? It was the, oh yeah, but this question remains, what, I don't know specifically why the 401k thing was removed, but my guess then is they just didn't, it would be politically unpopular and they preferred to generate the revenue someplace else. Again, best guess. Make of it what you will. Let's see, is the prince ditching the Palestinians to focus with Trump on Iran? What's his play here? I don't think he's ditching the Palestinians. Again, I don't, like I said earlier, I don't think this is any change in traditional policy for the region. Traditional policy is just to use the Palestinian issue as a political tool to generate support when you feel you need it, when you feel your legitimacy is being threatened. But otherwise, you don't really ever act on it much. It's just a talking point almost. And the Saudis, in that sense, had already dumped the Palestinians. They already didn't really care that much. You know, the United States recognizing Jerusalem kind of forces them to publicly admonish the United States and Israel. And maybe they'll take some token measures diplomatically. But the substantive strategic cooperation between Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis Iran, that will continue regardless. That's going to get priority more than any. That's going to get principal priority over anything else. Is the print, yeah. How does he view the arc of the right-wing shift in European politics over the last few decades? Where does he see it going? Yeah, we've talked about this a good amount over the past few months. This is sort of the to give a truncated version of previous comments. Basically, it's the result of structural changes in the economy, changing winners and losers. Obviously, there's been a lot of people who have suffered from the churn, the lack of certainty, the lack of job security, and those people have not really gotten a good reason to support the status quo. They want some kind of change, but the reasons they're struggling are not easy to resolve without just huge changes in the economic system itself. This kind of goes back to the question, the previous question about how do you sell free market economics, a free market economy, to the people who kind of lose out from that kind of economic system. There is no good answer to that. And European status quo politicians of the center left and center right have struggled mightily to try to answer that, to try to kind of get people on board to say that, yeah, you're struggling, but over the long term, it works out. But that's, you know, again, long-term arguments don't really sell if you're hungry and if you don't have a job. So it's the result has been an ongoing schism in Europe and European political culture between the populists who want significant changes. They've been a little ambiguous about what kind of specific significant changes they want, but they're pushing hard for quote-unquote significant changes. And then there's sort of the status quo powers who want some variation of liberal governance. And I say liberal using the classical sense of the word for the Americans listening. It's liberal, classical liberalism. But the center-left and center-right Europe are both liberal in that sense. And they have different ideas about the extent of state intervention, but fundamentally they're both liberal. The populists have a different perspective. They want significantly more state action, either for reasons that would appeal to the far right or for reasons that would appeal to the far left. You know, they tend to vary on what specific policies they want. Again, populism tends to be very ambiguous on the details, purposely and strategically so on the part of their leadership. But it stems from that uncertainty caused by economic dislocation. And that's kind of the fundamental driving force there that underlies a lot of this shift in politics. And it's not just Europe. You see this everywhere. Every country and region of the world is experiencing this right now. You know, China, the United States, India, Africa, you know, Latin America. Everybody gets hit by it and is having to deal with it in different ways. So that's basically my perspective of the rightward shift, so to speak, in European politics. I don't even know that I would call it a rightward shift. It's more disestablishmentarianism, something like just discontent with the establishment and a desire for some alternative to status quo politics. So it's more populism. Sorry?
Which gave rise to one of the longest words, which is anti-disestablishmentarianism. Which, to a certain point, you just add enough negatives on the front, and you're just trying to be silly. You could just go back a word.
Yeah, kind of chasing your own tail after a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not Germans. We like our words nice and succinct here.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as that's basically my view on it. I don't really have an opinion on it per se. I wouldn't call it good or bad. I would just say that it's a result of those forces, and that if liberal governance is to continue in Europe as the dominant political form, you know, the dominant form of institutional design and political discourse, etc., then that fundamental detachment of significant parts of the working class from economic gains has to be resolved somehow. And it has to be done in a way that appeals to the political preferences and sensitivities of that group. You know, it's not enough just to throw money at them, you know, because a lot of it is cultural too. A lot of them are upset about cultural changes wrought by economic changes. They're upset about cultural changes wrought by immigration. You know, the free movement of capital and labor and technological innovation have cultural ramifications, and that's, you know, that's as responsible for the discontent as economic uncertainty is. So if you just throw money at them without addressing the cultural side of the issue, you're still screwed. You have to come up with something that appeals to their sensibility in order to kind of reconcile them to the process. You don't have to get all of them. You don't have. Some of them are just dead enders who are going to stick with it, whatever you do. But if you can convert enough populists over back to the sort of center-left, center-right consensus liberal politics with enough policy changes, that would be enough to address the problem. It would at least be enough to kind of get past the sort of liberal crisis we're in, or have been in for the past 10, 15 years. As for where I see it going, again, it just depends on how that plays out. If you can reconcile enough people with enough policy innovation and policy shifts, then you'll see a return to something resembling the status quo. But if not, populist forces will just keep getting stronger, basically, and you'll see increasingly hectic, radical policies implemented in a sort of fleeting effort to try to deal with the structural changes in the economy. Because again, the issues that people suffer from are not easy to solve. Like if your factory automates and you get laid off, well, what then? You ban automation? Good luck. I mean, they just move the factory then. Protectionism? Well, that'll benefit some people in the economy, but that'll also create a lot of problems in the economy for other people. So then you have a schism between winners and losers again, and then you're right back where you started. You've just changed who the winners are. That's the only thing you've done then, and that creates just as much political discontent. What you want is a fundamental equilibrium, a balance, a consensus solution that pleases everyone, or at least enough of the voters on both sides, or however many sides, probably going to fracture, so you have multiple political poles. That's one of the other manifestations of political discontent in the era of transition we're in. But if you can create enough of a consensus with enough of the voters, then you're okay. But I don't see a lot of that happening in Europe right now. European leaders have really been dragging their feet in terms of addressing that liberal crisis and coming up with policies to kind of reconcile and attract back those dissident voters. And I think one of the good things they've done is accept a multi-track Europe. That sort of debate about the future of the European Union and what it should look like. The idea of a multi-track Europe, I think, is a good one, because it gives the people who want more centralization and federalization the option of doing so, while not requiring those other states that are skeptical of it to do so they can maintain more of their sovereignty. That was a good compromise. It might not be enough of a compromise, but that's the kind of compromise they're going to have to make in the future. There's probably also going to be significant curbs on immigration. I think it's a lot easier to compromise on immigration and lower that than it will be to convince people to create protectionist measures and capital controls and things like that. Limiting immigration will have a much less significant effect on an economy than capital controls and things like that side of the economy. So probably immigration will be the other compromise they make in the future. They've already kind of moved in that direction. There's already been a reversal of the open door policy to Syrian immigrants and the immigrants from Africa and Eritrea, etc. That sort of wave of immigrants is kind of being turned back. The doors are sort of closing on them in recognition of that of the need for a policy compromise on that issue. So there will probably be more of that in the future in order to preserve the single market and the sort of liberal notions of economic management that the single market and the European Union represent. They'll trade immigration for those, basically. That seems the most likely compromise going forward. Again, just a guess on my part. It's anybody's guess what it will look like going forward and how effective European leaders deal with this issue. You know, we may well end up, regardless, with a series of populist governments in Europe that struggle to fulfill the demands of their voters and end up being unpopular themselves. Or they just throw goodies to their constituents. They just pass policies that narrowly benefit their voters and hurt others, and then just basically run on that kind of politics. You know, a kind of patronage politics, basically. that would be a big problem for liberal democratic societies, because it's really hard to maintain a liberal democracy with patronage politics corrupting the political system like that. It's much easier to get into a system like that than it is to get out of it. So I would highly recommend it be avoided at all costs, or at least almost at all costs. But it may be that there's no way to avoid it. It just depends on the leadership and how things pan out going forward. So that's kind of a messy, fudgy answer to that. Off the top of my head, that's the best I can do. That's a deep question. There's a lot of different angles you can kind of talk about there. Oh, and of course I missed the second part of the question. As an example, the FN viewed as having a legit shot in the last elections, Brexit, Polish right-wing party in power, Hungary having a bit of revisionism regarding World War II, etc. Okay. Yeah, so not a second part of the question. Yeah, my answer is the same then. Yeah. That just kind of elaborates some of the manifestations in Europe. Let's see, so the next one was, now that Manny Pacquiao, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, so I apologize. There you go. I'm sure that guy is a part of the Philippines parliament. How many people do you think he would knock out if a parliament fight broke out? Good question. Probably all of them, if he's a professional boxer. Quick and dirty guess. That assumes that he wasn't killed in the process, though. Philippine politicians and politics can get a little dirty. Duterte is an example of that. Yeah, he's hanging in there. His popularity rating is kind of hovering about. It's not as high as it used to be, but he's not going to get impeached anytime soon. Put it like that. Let's see. Well, I was wondering about trust in the media in relation to retractions over Russia-Trump, and whether he thinks that it is a serious problem. We don't have a media we can trust, and whether we were ever right to trust any news media in the first place. Whether or not, well, this kind of goes back to discussions we've had before about media bias. All media is biased. There isn't any getting around that. The trick is to kind of try to understand the bias and to control for it, to use diverse sources of information, and try to learn the technical side of issues, and I kind of get into policy analysis and kind of really try to understand the inner workings of given issues, so that it's harder to manipulate and misinform someone who is kind of familiar with a given issue and the technical side of it. Individuals, the abortion issue, whatever kind of issue. Once you get into the details and kind of look at it from that perspective, it's harder for people to bullshit you, because you can kind of see when they're bullshitting you, when they're kind of twisting facts or misrepresenting data or something like that. Obviously, you can't do that for every issue, and even to a great extent for a given issue, but trying to do that will better prepare you, to kind of give you a better defense against misinformation than not doing anything. So in so much as you can, I would recommend that. And yeah, should you trust the media at all? I mean, there is no one media. There's lots of different sources. So if there's one source you don't trust, you can always find another one. And again, I wouldn't recommend you go to one source and say, okay, this is my one true faith. This is my true source. Everything here is where I get my information. I wouldn't recommend doing that, because there's inevitably going to be problems with that source in some way and at some point. You just kind of have to take a broad view of the information landscape and try to take in as much as you can and be as skeptical as you can and try to process it as much as you can. Don't take anything on faith
as well.
Yeah, don't take anything on faith. Just, take information you consume from media as a starting point, not an end point. You can say, okay, I heard this in the media. Let's follow that up and see how true it is. Let's see how it holds up to scrutiny. And then you can kind of go from there. You should always be skeptical when consuming information. That's, you don't go to class and just take information. You kind of analyze it. That's how it's presented. It should be in class. Information should be presented in a way that allows you to understand all of its nuances. The way media is structured as a business model, you can't do that. But you should apply that same level of scrutiny to the information you receive from them. So were we ever right to trust any news media in the first place? I wouldn't have recommended you trust any media completely in the first place. I would have recommended a diverse pool of information sources that you used as a starting point for your own analysis of given issues. Obviously, if it's something like local news and some local event, you can kind of trust it more, because there's probably not as much reason to lie. Also, keep in mind, as important in the news as what's said, or misleading, is what's not said. It's quite possible that a lot of media outlets will just ignore news that's important, or leave out minor details in a story that are important, for whatever reason. They might have an agenda or some other motivation, or be lazy, or it could be anything. And that's another reason why it's important to try to inform yourself independently of media. That way you can kind of understand all the bits of the story or of an issue that are being left out of the conversation in media. I should probably just write out something for this kind of question, because every time I have a different answer for it every time it comes up. It's hard to remember all the different angles of it.
The same themes come up, though. I feel like that would be a thing we can add in. Maybe for next year as a goal is having a survival guide for this time period. What does he mean, liberals? Classical liberalism. What is classical liberalism? What is a cryptocurrency and how does it work? Should I invest in more Bitcoin or no? I just want to get rich here and listen to the news.
Let's see, liberal and whatever this was. Media, right? Media sources. So I'll write those down and I'll try to work on that at some point. Let's see. How do we prepare for a future in which automation runs millions out of the job over the next couple centuries? Well, that's the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? How do you handle something like that? If indeed it does happen, the next couple centuries is a very long time frame. Anything could happen. It may be that something happens that makes human labor competitive relative to automated labor, and there's a shift back to it at some point. Who knows? It's anybody's guess. But for now, let's assume here that in the future automation does pan out such that it eliminates millions of human jobs over the next couple centuries. How do you handle that? That just kind of depends on your own political preferences. I'll go back to the answer I kind of gave before, which is that different societies will have different solutions that are a function of their own politics. And so how a given society or how you individually want to deal with it is just a function of your own preferences. It may be that some people prefer a sort of maximum leisure culture system where the robots do all the work and everybody is kind of a rich plantation owner who just kind of lounges around and does whatever they want. Maybe they read, maybe they do science, maybe they don't do anything, just whatever you like. On the other hand, you may have a completely different system in which you find a way to incentivize work somehow, or in which you, I don't know, enslave all of the jobless people and have them do your bidding. I mean, there's any number of directions you could go there. It just depends on kind of what you want out of a society, what kind of society that you want in the future, and what do you want it to look like. And different people will have different answers, and they'll have to hash that out in the future. Do you think humans are... And yeah, I know that's kind of a cop-out answer, because it's not a specific answer. It's not a specific policy. But there are so many different possible outcomes and so many different political preferences, and it's impossible to kind of guess at which one will be the successful one. And again, it's a spectrum as to policies that you can use to deal with it, and it ranges everywhere from, absolute automation to none. You can just completely undo it completely and say, no, we're not going to do that at all, and just ban it. And then there's everything in between. And without going into detail on what specific policies there are, the ultimate equilibrium is just going to be a function of everybody hashing out their different political preferences and reaching a compromise. So I give a cop-out answer in that regard because, for one, I don't know a whole lot of specific examples for how to deal with it, but I can make an educated guess as to how whatever specific policy is settled on will be settled on. That'll be that process of compromise. And given that I don't know what the distribution of preferences is, I can't really make an educated guess as to what the likelihood is of any given policy compromise coming to fruition. So that's my minor defense. That's my minor defense of my cop-out answer. You know, take it or leave it, I guess. Let's see. How do we prepare for that? All right. How do you think the humans are capable of destroying corruption, or are we inherently flawed as a species? Wow, these are deep questions tonight.
Well, we've talked about the trend before of corruption over time and how pretty much every country that's established starts with more corruption and gradually moves toward less corruption.
Mm. Yeah, there's institutional designs that you can have. There are ways you can use institutions to mitigate it, and as your economy develops economically, you can generally better fund and empower institutions to deal with it, so that helps. But at the root, will there always be corruption? Is there something about human nature that ensures there will always be some degree of corruption regardless? Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes back to the, you know, the old debate about human evil, you know, human nature. Is human nature fundamentally, or are we fundamentally good? And I'm not as familiar with that argument as perhaps Neuro might be. You might know more about it, that side of that particular debate than I do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think certainly it's true that there will always be some degree of corruption. I think there is, human nature being what it is, will always facilitate some degree of it. There would have to be some significant change in environment to mitigate it, I think. And even then, there would probably still be some, because there's probably still be somebody who did it just for fun, even. But as for, are we inherently flawed as a species, that's a deep philosophical question. That's a whole debate in and of itself.
I mean, you could give a biological answer and say that, is our cognition imperfect? Is our memory imperfect? The easy answer to that is yes. We don't have perfect memory. We can misremember stuff, and we're pretty bad at math, just as biological meat bags compared with computers. Computers are going to outperform us in a number of tasks.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, definitely flawed in that regard. There could be big implications for such a improvement in artificial intelligence going forward. That's part of why everybody's asking about automation and how to deal with it. That's one of the big trends going forward. But yeah, corruption will probably always be there. But it, you know, depending on how the environment changes, how institutions changes, etc. When I say environment, I mean social environment, just the way society is structured, the economy is structured, etc. Depending on how things like that change, it could be mitigated or exacerbated in the long run. Oh, destroying corruption. Are we capable of destroying? Yeah, same answer. Speaking of memes, do you have any memes you enjoy, perhaps even a favorite? Not really. Can't say that I do. I'm not a big memer, really. I just watch Reddit like everybody else. You know, memes come and go. What effect will McCain not voting have on the chances of passing the tax bill? None, probably, because I think they have enough votes to pass it without him. They can afford to lose 2 votes, I think. Because Roy Moore was defeated in the Alabama special election, but Doug Jones is not going to take that seat until January, or something like that. So, it's still going to be a Republican-held seat. I don't remember who the current senator is, but he's still going to be there. So I think they still have the votes to get it passed. It's still highly likely that it will be passed, from what I've read. How do you see the Northern Irish border being resolved with the UK exiting the EU? Yeah, that's a difficult question. That's been a big sticking point in the Brexit negotiations. For those not familiar with this, the United Kingdom shares a land border with the Republic of Ireland, and the British have a territory on the island called Northern Ireland, and it's, without getting into the whole history of Irish independence and the Irish Civil War. There's been a lot of conflict on the island about whether or not Northern Ireland should be integrated and annexed by the Republic of Ireland, or whether it should remain a part of the United Kingdom. And that led to a lot of violence in the mid-20th century. I don't remember what they called it, the Time of Troubles, I think. And it eventually, that period of violence ended with the Good Friday Agreement, which was 98, I want to say. Yeah, please correct me if I'm wrong. That's kind of a guess off the top of my head. But it ended with the Good Friday Agreement. And since part of that agreement was basically an open border, people in Northern Ireland and Ireland could kind of freely traverse the border as they like, for whatever reason, economic activity, to visit family, whatever. It used to be a heavily policed border, but since that agreement, it's been opened up considerably, and obviously being in the single market in the European Union has also helped in maintaining that border. But now that the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, there's a question about whether or not a hard border will be reimposed. And implementing a hard border puts the Good Friday Agreement in danger, because again, that was an important tenet of the agreement. But if the United Kingdom maintains an open border with Ireland, that effectively means they have an open border with the European Union, which means that there's free flow of goods between the United Kingdom and the European Union, which means they haven't really left the single market or the European Union. So that's a difficult square to circle. There's been some talk about using a technological solution where goods are sort of tagged as they leave the factory, and so then you can kind of track them, and so there's an electronic border, which otherwise allows people to move across it with. So there's kind of a block. There's a border as far as the trade of goods and services, but there's not a border in terms of physically crossing it. That's the technological solution. I don't know how effective that would be, though, because there would be people who would cheat. If you're a guy who makes his living trading stuff or making stuff in the factory, you have every incentive to lie your ass off about, how many goods you produce. You can take the tags off. You can just not tag things to begin with. You can maybe only tag half of your stuff, or you could tag some of your stuff and then sell the other stuff on the black market. I mean, there was already a fertile, vibrant black market trade before the Good Friday Agreement, before the border was opened up. That could easily come back. And it wouldn't be hard to cheat I would not think it would be hard anyway to cheat an electronic border type system. So that's not a great solution, but the other solution is just to implement a hard border again and just to say to hell with it and deal with the consequences as they come. That could mean more violence again. Nobody wants that, but that could be what happened. It could be that the Irish question becomes a leading political issue again. Nobody really wants that, though, so that's unlikely. People would really rather not do that. Another solution is to just stay in the European Customs Union, to just maintain, to do whatever is necessary, to make whatever compromises are necessary, to keep the United Kingdom in the Customs Union of the European Union single market. So effectively, you're still in the European Union economically, but you don't have any voting rights. That obviously isn't really attractive either. But other than those three solutions, there's not a lot else. You can do different combinations, you can do variations, but fundamentally those are kind of your three choices. And none of them are really ideal. I think the recent trajectory, the momentum recently with the recent deal that was reached, was they're kind of moving towards just staying in the single market and maintaining the UK's membership in the customs union. They haven't really reached an agreement on the Irish border issue. The way they moved forward was to say, well, we're going to stay in the single market, so don't worry about it. Whether or not they actually do stay in the single market, the actual details of how that gets worked out have yet to be negotiated, and it could be that becomes a sticking point again when it does become a negotiated, when they do start negotiating that again, because it could be that some of the details are controversial. That remains to be seen, though. For now, everybody's just happy that they've moved beyond it and are starting to talk about other priorities, which have kind of been on the back burner for a very long time. Yeah, if I had to make a guess, I would say that the United Kingdom will go with the regulatory alignment thing. And to explain what that is, one of the aspects of the agreement that was made recently was that if the United Kingdom were to remain in the customs union, they would have to align their regulations, whatever regulations of the economy they had, with the European Union regulations. which is more or less what they do now in the European Union. So it kind of begs the question of, well, why are you leaving then? What's the point if you can't control what regulations you can or can't have? Agreeing beforehand, before you leave Brexit, to just maintain that regulatory alignment voluntarily without any, European Court of Justice enforcement over it, just kind of handshake agreement to do that. Hypothetically, you could break it any time you wanted, but then that would bring down the wrath of the European Union, and it creates a whole, issue there in the future. So they'll probably stick to that agreement in the future. They may even sign a treaty to that effect. And if they do, that would be a significant blow to the pro-Brexit people. And they wouldn't like that at all. And I don't know if the current May government has the political support and legitimacy. Well, they have the legitimacy, but not the political support necessarily to survive something like that. They're already under a lot of heat from people who are both pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit in the Tories party. Not sure actually what that party is called. I guess they're just the Tories. Somebody from the UK can maybe correct me on that. But yeah, there's so much dissent within the Conservative Party in Britain that I don't think if they did it, she would get out unscathed. There probably will be an early election. It really does feel like it from what I've read. But I don't know enough about British politics to make an accurate prediction there, a confident prediction there. But that's, off the top of my head, those are some thoughts on the Northern Irish border issue. Probably they'll just stick in the single market, because that's the easiest way to maintain the open border without any significant economic complications.
We just got a really big host from Puck, who is a teammate of mine. Thank you very much for that, Puck. New viewers, this is a live discussion with a friend of mine, codename Agent Smith. We're talking about foreign policy, economics, world history, current events, that kind of thing. So feel free to ask questions in the chat. If they're good questions that play into his area of expertise, they'll be passed along and you can join the discussion. I hope Puck had an awesome stream and all that too. What's up?
Yeah, new people, welcome. Hopefully I'm not too boring. Let's see, so the next one was, can you talk about the causes leading to the dissolution of the ancient Roman republic's middle class? Do you see similarities with today? I would want to read more about the ancient Roman republic's middle class before I commented on it, but from what I know, from what I have read, this was a long time ago, and it wasn't like a really detailed academic type reading. It was just something I read online, was that the Roman middle class dissipated with time as the government became more oppressive towards them. Basically, the Roman Empire, well, yeah, you were asking specifically about the Roman Republic's middle class, not the Roman Empire's middle class, so that's different. Yeah, I'd have to go with I don't know then. I know a little bit about the dissolution of the Roman Empire's middle class. That's, the subsequent military governments, what were in effect military governments seizing power in successive crises, saw the public as basically a resource that they could extract value from. And so they significantly raised taxes, oppressively so, on the productive middle class in the Roman territories, in Rome. And obviously that a lot of people were upset about that, because it's not just that they were high taxes, they were cripplingly high taxes. They were basically just trying to take all of the value of their work from them. And people started to just leave the cities, because there just wasn't any incentive to stay. They were actually being impoverished. They were getting poorer by staying in the cities and continue to work in their trades. And so the government, well, not the government, the Roman Empire, such as it was, started passing laws that required people to stay in place. They had to stay in the city where they were, and they were forced by law to continue working their trade. And over time, that worked for a while, but over time, more and more people fled the cities trying to get away from that, because there wasn't nobody wanted to be poor and working a middle-class type job in crafts. They wanted to kind of get full value for their stuff, so they would just leave. And the Roman economy and the Roman Empire declined accordingly. But again, that's just what I've read. If someone knows better, please correct me. I welcome criticism. I want to learn too. So please, by all means, anybody who knows better on something, or I leave something out, or I say something stupid, please do contribute in chat. But for the Roman Republic's middle class, I don't know anything about that. I don't think I've ever read anything about them declining. I didn't even know they had declined. I thought that the Roman middle class had survived the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire relatively intact. Again, could easily be wrong. I'm not a Roman history buff. Not quite my area. Actually, nobody's asked about World War II in a while. That's one of my areas. When was the last time we did a World War II question? Let's see. So I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't quite know enough about the Roman Republic, that period of Rome's history, to kind of answer this question. But hopefully, I kind of gave you something to chew on there, because I do know a little. I have read something about the Roman Empire's middle class. How do you feel about the current state of pollution on a global scale, and more so the clear impact it's having? I've heard many friends use the Earth goes through cycles argument a few times. Curious what your views are on it. Personally, I think we're in some pretty serious trouble, or rather one of the future generation. Yeah, climate science is definitely one of my weak areas. I haven't read nearly as much about that. You know, in the United States, the policy side of environmental regulations and dealing with climate change, it's basically deadlocked. There's really not much of anything happening here. The only time the government here in the United States does anything on it is when it's kind of meaningless. Like the Paris Accords, for example, that the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Accords famously. But really, the Paris Accords don't really require you to do much. It's more of a suggestion. Would you please pledge to do this? Okay, I pledge to do that. And then there's no enforcement mechanism. You can just not do it and there's no cost. So it was kind of the Trump administration symbolically pulling out of a symbolic agreement. It didn't really mean much. Those are the kinds of agreements that the United States government likes, because it means they don't have to do anything. So I generally don't read much about it on that account. I just don't see, it's not generally much of an issue here, policy-wise, in terms of designing policy. There's been some innovative stuff done in, I think, Europe. The European Union and European countries generally put more effort into that, policy-wise into that. And from what I have read, has generally been from them, from Europeans experimenting with, you know, this, that, or the other environmental scheme. You know, the carbon trading regime, other such things. You know, the France trying to phase out diesel trucks, I think, or diesel vehicles over the next 10 years. Generally, it's the Europeans doing things like that. We don't really do that over here in the U.S. much. But how do I feel about it? Don't really know enough about it to feel confident about feelings, so I don't feel much about it, basically. I just kind of moot. I would need to read more about it. Maybe we all burn alive in 100 years. I don't know. But given that it's deadlocked, whatever's going to happen is probably going to happen regardless.
Well,
a very cynical approach.
One of the quotes that we kind of refer to a lot during these discussions is, change happens when the pain to remain the same becomes too great. So it seems like a lot of the changes so far have been stuff like the barrier reef going to the wayside. And that doesn't really impact our survival that much, so it's setting off alarm bells for people who care about that and about the life there. But for a lot of countries, economies, and businesses, it's not directly impacting them, so why should they care? Kind of thing. Bees are also impacted too, I think.
Sorry, oh yeah, bees. Yeah, they've also been impacted. It's manifested in a number of different ways. Again, I haven't read enough about it to list them all, but as I understand it, it's manifesting in a variety of ways in different ecosystems. But for the record, that quote, the pain, people were, whatever it was, I can't.
Change happens when the pain to remain the same becomes too great.
That's a Kukio quote. He's the one I heard that from originally. I don't know if you heard it from originally, but for me, I associate that heavily with Kukio.
Yes, I did.
And he was a smart guy, and we miss him. We wish he could be here. He would have loved this. He would have had a lot to say.
Well, this was very similar to the types of discussions we would have, where we kind of range all over the place. We have a lot of these good meandering answers to very broad and complex questions and stuff.
Yeah.
Makes for a good time.
Let's see. Pollution on a global scale is kind of getting to be a problem for places like China that are kind of economically developing in the sort of middle stage, that industrialization stage of economic development. particularly a problem for them, although China's kind of shifting out of that, so that'll be less of a problem for them going forward. It'll probably be much more of a problem for Africa, since Africa is probably going to be the next big center of economic development in the world, and they've yet to go through that process of industrialization, or at least most of Africa. Obviously, South Africa and maybe Egypt and Ethiopia to a degree, but most of Africa has not really industrialized a lot yet. So the amount of pollution they generate going forward could be the significant source of pollution in the late in the 21st century into the 22nd century. But yeah, again, not my area, so I can't comment too much on it one way or the other. Oh, and he added, I mean, more than just the damage from that pollution, like the sea plastic, that kind of stuff. Yeah, the answer is the same. I mean, it could well be a problem, but given the policy deadlock, I have to assume that it's whatever's going to happen is going to happen. As the Kukio quote, as Neuro just said, if things do substantively get worse, that could change. But it might be too late to do anything about it by then. I don't know enough about the climate science and where it's at to know when that point would be, to kind of give you a year or a date when that threshold would be crossed. But for now, in the United States at least, there's pretty thorough deadlock. It's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere anytime soon here. Let's see, do you have any knowledge or opinions on the methods of teaching middle, high school education, social studies, history? What in your mind is a proper line to draw in terms of the myths of history and actual history? Since you can't exactly teach young children about Christopher Columbus as being a murderer, as an example, or how the northern states also held slaves prior to the Civil War, etc. Ugh, you're lucky you don't live in Texas, at least I hope you don't, because the Texas School Board Commission would have very thorough opinions about that. They kind of answer that question by just being very specific about what you should or should not be teaching. You can kind of teach outside the lines if you want, but they don't like that much. Yeah, I'm not a teacher, so I can't really give you specific advice. I like to talk about stuff, that's about it, but I don't teach anybody really. So I wouldn't know what a good way to go about teaching history would be. I always liked stories, personally. I loved history when I was a kid. It was one of my favorite subjects. And the thing that I liked about it was the stories. So if you can kind of give it if you can teach it in a heuristic, almost anecdotal way, in a way that kind of brings characters to life and makes it clear what their motives are, and describes systems. I liked systems when I was a kid, so that also appealed. But that's just me. That probably doesn't appeal to everybody. But for me, just kind of giving the big picture, people, what they're doing, and how they fit into a big picture was the method of learning history I liked best. But I don't know if that's feasible for everybody, or if maybe people aren't already doing that writ large. Again, not a teacher, not sure what the whole, what would you call it, pedagogy? Science of pedagogy. There you go.
Words.
I'm not sure where that science is on that, and what's ideal or optimal, or what the data says, and that's kind of more what I would want to look at before answering that question.
Well, on that note, to tell a story, one of my first university history courses was very different from kind of grade school in that it told the dark side of a lot of characters, where it's not like they're not all heroes. A lot of young school children kind of programs pitch it to where the leaders of your nation were awesome and the world was crap, but they were courageous and did the right thing, and now we have our country or state or whatever. With Texas, we get that in double, where we have not only the great nation of the United States, but we have the great state of Texas that was doing the right thing and breaking away from Mexico. But if you kind of learn about the dark side of that decision, it was basically that we were just squatting on their land and saying, fuck you, make us move. I'm not gonna move. This is my hut and there's no one else around here. Texas is huge. I can set up here if I want to. Don't impose your rule on me. So that's a lesson that not everyone gets to learn, but being able to consider not just the merits but also the detriments of major characters. Most characters in history and currently in the world are complex characters where they have some attributes that might be good and some that might be bad. We're all kind of mixed bags when you boil it down. Some are better than others, of course, but hero worship, generally speaking, is going to cause you to turn a blind eye to the bad aspects of people. So a Steven Pinker quote is, "Be a disciple of no one, because they will lead you astray in some capacity."
Yeah, and I'm not real sure what the best answer is there. Just in terms of, specifically in terms of myths of history and actual history, how do you draw the line between them? And you know, it may be that for younger children, it may be just better to go with myths, because, you know, teaching actual history requires some analytical ability. It requires some perspective, some balance. It's not necessarily something I would expect most young children to be able to do. So maybe start them with the myths, and then when they get older, you can kind of transition in late middle school or high school into the more advanced stuff, the more complex aspects of the history. I don't think myths are bad always. Myths have a purpose. I mean, if they do help social cohesion, if they do help people have a common frame of reference, they can be useful in that regard. But there does come a point when people should have a more nuanced, more in-depth understanding of history, and that's better probably for the older students who are a little more mature and a little more experienced, and maybe are more ready to take a more analytical approach to history.
To take a minor tangent, positive illusions can be demonstrated to have some net positive effects for individuals taking risks and making some bold moves in their situations. So even though it might not necessarily be the best and most true of cases, if it can get people to take initiatives that they wouldn't otherwise, that are good initiatives, then positive illusions can be beneficial. But they can also bite you in the ass. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, where we have the true reality that's in front of us, and then there's also the way that we interpret that and imagine that. And how a lot of times, if you just believe that I can do this thing, and you go for it and do it, your chances of doing it are much, much greater than if you said from the outset, nah, I probably can't do this, so I'm not going to try.
Yeah, there are lies and then there are white lies. And you can tell those lies to yourself as much as you can to anybody else. And a white lie to yourself that helps you get better, why not? Not necessarily. And you can do something similar with society. Societal myths can act as that sort of white lie that does benefit society in a way. And like you say, there are risks to it. And really the answer there is that individual communities at individual schools will have to kind of determine where that line is. It's more up to them, because it's their kids. It should be their decision, really.
Yeah.
And if they want to take one particular risk in one regard or take less of a risk, it's kind of up to them. I would, in my opinion, you know, make of that what you will. In general, I lean more towards the sort of liberal, again, classically liberal perspective that decentralization is better. More decision making in the more decision making in the power of individuals and lower levels of government is probably better than higher levels, because then people have more power over their lives and how they live them. So that, I would say, figure out kind of, if you're really struggling with where to draw the line, kind of ask the parents. Maybe they'll be able to tell you. And if they don't care, then you can just kind of do what you want. But if they do care, then that kind of gives you some guidance. On the other hand, if it's not that nuanced, if you're more just thinking in general, should you be more analytical or more on the myth side of things, then I would say just base it on age. You know, if you think they're old enough, and if they're old enough, if they're mature enough, then you can go with the more analytical approach. But otherwise, maybe stick with the myths. You can debunk them if they're older but not mature. In that case, it's, you know, you don't want people who are older running around with just historical myths. That's probably not healthy for society. But if you don't really think they're ready for analysis, an analytical approach, but they are kind of getting near, getting older, like in high school, maybe you can present the myths, but kind of give them some nuance. Say, all right, well, here's how it's maybe not true, without necessarily completely just getting into the details about how do you debunk them, what is the historical record, who are the different actors, blah, 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 the analytical style of approach. More just a binary, here's the myth, but here's how it's not true. and just kind of have that be the balance. Again, completely talking out of my ass. I have no idea, really. I'm not an educator. I haven't been following, the research of education or educating children, so I'm not the best person to ask. But yeah, my best guess is that that would be my random, ill-informed advice that you probably shouldn't follow. Take it or leave it. Make of it what you will. Don't say I didn't warn you. Let's see. So I'm sorry if that's not a great answer. Again, not really quite my area. What are the necessary and sufficient comments? What are the necessary and sufficient comments of statehood? What nations barely deserve the name, and what entities should be considered nations but aren't?
I think they might mean criteria.
Ah, okay. All right. What criteria of statehood? We've talked a little bit about this before with the Catalonia thing.
Yeah.
Like, there really aren't any.
Monopoly on violence.
Yeah, well, that's true. In terms of within a country, is a state? Well, if it has a monopoly of violence, yes. Whether or not it's recognized as a state by the outside community, though, in the international community, there's really not any criteria there. And really, it's outside recognition that determines statehood more than anything. You can have a piss-poor state, but if it has recognition, it's a state. Like the question implies, there are countries in the world that barely have states, but yet still get recognition. Somalia is probably the best example of that. Yemen would be another one. Both of those have UN-recognized governments that are considered broadly the legitimate governments of those countries, but they have virtually no power in them whatsoever. In Somalia, power is restricted pretty much to the capital, Mogadishu, and a few other places. And, even the other places it only controls because it has outside help from Kenya and Ethiopia. And Yemen, the government, such as it is, only controls, the coast, basically, the southwestern coastal region. And even there, it's a little dicey. There are southern separatists who don't necessarily want to help the government reunify the country. There are actually southern separatists who would be quite happy if the country broke up, because then they could have their independent South Yemen back. Yemen used to be two different countries. It used to be North Yemen and South Yemen for a long time, through much of the 20th century. It was unified in 1994, and just immediately people were like, "Oh, we shouldn't have done that." Separatist sentiment took off really quickly, and partly it was because of the corruption of the Saleh regime. And he's the dictator that got thrown out in the Arab Spring, and was still around, actually. He hung around. He was a significant political force in the country. His political network was very powerful in Yemen, even after he lost power. And he had actually allied with the Houthis in the current conflict in order to resist the UN-recognized government being supported and propped up effectively by the Saudis. He got a little tired of that, though, a couple weeks ago, and he actually made an entreaty to the Saudi government, saying that he would be willing to negotiate some kind of peace deal. And yeah, he was dead within a couple of days, I think. He didn't last long. The Houthis were pretty quick to turn on him. And so he's dead. His movement is still there. Well, not his movement, but his network is still there. But it's not clear to me as an outside observer the extent to which that network can maintain its cohesiveness without Salah. And if it does, how powerful it would be, given that it's kind of isolated from the government-held territories. It's more in the interior, surrounded by the Houthis. Anyway, that was a wild-ass tangent. What was the original question? Now down here, what is it? Statehood, right. So yeah, that's an example of a state being recognized as having that's an example of a country having a state that probably shouldn't be recognized as such. It's not really the state of Yemen. It's more of a faction in the Yemen civil war fighting for control. On the other hand, there are countries that have governments, that have states, but are not recognized as being independent countries, and those are relatively few and far between. There's not very many of those. Somaliland is the principal one that I can think of. That had been a part of Somalia and then broke off after the country just collapsed in the early 90s. The region of Somaliland, though, maintained its government, its local government, and it continued to function just fine. And they actually have one of the more interesting governments in the region. They have two houses of what Congress, their equivalent of Congress. Their legislative branch has two houses, and the upper house is actually tribal elders, which was a pretty neat little innovation, given that tribal politics tends to be the bane of African politics. It's an endless problem for much of the continent, but in Somaliland, they just kind of incorporated it into the system of government, into their institutional design, and it's kind of helped control for tribal conflict. It's actually ended up as one of the more politically stable countries in Africa. But despite the fact that it's very stable and relatively economically prosperous, it's not particularly developed, but does relatively well. Despite those facts, it hasn't received recognition, and that's because nobody wants to piss off the Somali government. Well, I shouldn't say piss off Somali. Nobody's afraid of pissing off the Somali government, but they don't want to alienate it. They want the Somali government to succeed in unifying the country and restoring stability to Somalia. And that government does not recognize Somaliland as having separated from Somalia. They want it back, basically. Somaliland does not want to come back to Somalia. I can't imagine why. But because of that, there's this tension between them. And the international community, for the moment, has sided with the UN-recognized government in Mogadishu over Somaliland. Could change in the long term, but for now, that's how it is, and the equilibrium is non-recognition. But kind of going back to the necessary and sufficient criteria of statehood, like Neuro pointed out, monopoly on violence. If there's some other force in your country that's punishing people for crimes, and they're not doing it according to your legal code, then you're not really much of a state. Effectively, that other group is the state, even if you might have the trappings of statehood. So having that monopoly on violence is critical. Legitimacy, being recognized as the state, is important. It's quite possible to just have no legitimacy, even if you do everything else the state does. You can argue at that point that you're not really a state so much as a mafia that's just exploiting and extracting value from the country in question. Some semblance of institutions, some court system, some kind of system. You don't necessarily have to have elections, but you do need to have offices, an administration that can govern the country. If you do have elections, you would have a legislative branch and a set of institutions defining the electoral system, responsibilities of representatives, etc. So the trappings of a state, i.e. institutions of state, those would also be prerequisite to recognition as a statehood. There's a difference between a state and a nation. A state really refers more to the government of a country, and well, a nation actually is something else also. A nation refers to kind of a people, a collective of people. So it's quite possible to have a nation that straddles multiple countries. So statehood is more about the government, and statehood refers to that state's recognition as being the government of the country in question. Generally, though, statehood and international recognition of a country kind of go together. They're sort of indistinguishable. It's both pretty much the same process. And international recognition is easily the most important factor determining whether or not you're an independent country, whether your state has statehood. And international recognition is fluid. There's no formula that determines whether or not you get international recognition. It just comes down to whether individual countries want to extend to you recognition. A lot of countries don't recognize Taiwan as being independent because of China. That's not because of any other factor than pressure from China, just from the sheer politics of that Taiwan-China issue. And really, it's politics in every case of recognition. Like, do you want to not recognize a country? Do you get a benefit from that? Well, in that case, you don't recognize them. But if you think you can get benefits from recognition, then you do that. It just depends on what you want, what a given country wants from another country in terms of vis-a-vis recognition. Generally, you extend recognition to independent states because you want positive relations so that you can have positive economic relations. You want investment from that country, or you want to invest in that country, or what have you. So generally, recognition is extended unless there's some overarching political issue or international issue that makes it inconvenient, in which case you don't and there's no penalty for not. Russia, for its part, recognizes several states, several countries, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, the Transdniester Republic. All of these are sort of little statelets, just very tiny countries that are not recognized by anybody but Russia, pretty much. There might be a few handful of others, but basically it's just Russia. And they're not really independent. They're entirely dependent on Russia, like economically, politically, diplomatically. And even in their own countries, such as they are, they don't have a whole lot of legitimacy per se, even if they are relatively popular. They're more or less, a lot of the times, run by mafioso types, kind of politically active criminal groups, which is not infrequent in Eastern Europe, especially the former Soviet space. But yeah, the whole issue of independence and recognition is very subjective. So it's kind of hard to pin down which countries should be recognized and aren't, and which are not recognized but should be. Well, the whole process is ambiguous to begin with, so I can't really give you a concrete answer. I mean, really, whatever you feel like. It's down to your individual preferences, really. Like, if you don't want to recognize Africa, you don't have to. You can lobby your government. I don't want to recognize this country in Africa, or that country in South America, or this other country in Asia. To hell with them. And if enough people agree with you, then that'll be what happens. It really is just that subjective. There's very little, if any, international law regulating that. I've heard that one of the factors that led to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany was a reaction against a relatively socially liberal culture in Berlin and other major German cities. Do you have any thoughts on this dynamic, and are there any parallels to today's events? Yeah, that was one of the factors. There was Bismarck's Germany, the Imperial Germany, was conservative and not as liberal culturally. But the Weimar Republic, or Weimar Republic, or I'm not sure how to pronounce that. It's probably Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was much more liberal. It was much more open. It was less regulated. It was just more of a liberal society in general. But that kind of rubbed a lot of conservatives the wrong way. And again, not being that far removed from what was a semi-authoritarian Imperial Germany, they did have liberal institutions, but the Kaiser was kind of paramount. They were not far enough removed from that sort of Kaiser model of governance to kind of such that the conservative forces were comfortable with that liberal culture, with that kind of liberal society. And so the corresponding, what I guess you could call decadence, what some conservatives would call liberal decadence, that the emergence of that over time after the war in the 1920s and 30s, what's the word? Sufficiently antagonized conservatives, such that they turned on the Weimar Republic and started embracing radical groups. And not just the Nazis, also communists. Nazis and communists were both very powerful political groups in especially the late 20s, early 30s, I think. The victory of the Nazis over the communists was kind of paved the way forward for the Nazis to set up a one-party state. They had to deal with the communists first, but once they did win that big battle with the communists, it was pretty much their game to lose. They pretty much had it in the bag. I'm simplifying. It was a complex evolution. There were other factors involved with the rise of the Nazis. Certainly economic dissatisfaction, the Great Depression had a big effect. General discontent about the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. There was a lot of German nationalists who hated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, saw it as immensely unfair, and wanted to undo it, either secretly or overtly, one or the other, whichever could be done. And probably any number of other factors that I don't know, because I'm not a Nazi Germany guy. I haven't studied the rise and fall of the Third Reich like some people have. And I knew a guy in college who did that. But yeah, I couldn't tell you much more beyond that. I think that it was a contributing fact. The relatively socially liberal culture in the Weimar Republic was a contributing factor to the rise of Nazi Germany, but I don't think it was a big factor. I don't think it was one of the main ones. I think the economic conditions and the discontent over Versailles were probably the main ones. Again, could easily be wrong. I welcome criticism. And if there's an important factor I'm missing here, please do contribute it in chat. But this is my understanding of it anyway. And yeah, there are obvious parallels with today. You know, the sort of, not collapse, but sort of the decline of conservative values relative to leftist or liberal values, or whatever you want to call them, has been one of the antagonists driving the populist right, not only in Europe but everywhere. You know, that's, again, like I said earlier when we were talking about this, it's not just economic dissatisfaction, it's also the cultural anxiety caused by all of the economic and social changes that have been happening over the past few decades. So certainly cultural anxiety, like what there was in the 1920s, some of that kind of does exist now as well, and is a contributing factor to the political turbulence, such as it is in world politics. But yeah, I can't do like a deep analysis of it because, again, not a 30s Third Reich guy. I haven't studied that history in detail, but from what I know about it, I don't think that was a huge factor. It was just a factor. Oh wow, we tapped out on questions.
Nice.
Oh, how are we doing on time? Are we okay?
Yeah, we're 7 hours and 39 minutes into today's broadcast. It's been a good one. I've been playing StarCraft the whole time because of that big host from another StarCraft streamer.
Do we have any time left, or?
Sure, dude. If you want to take 20 minutes and shoot the shit or talk about something that you were researching, go for it. You have green light for that.
Okay. 20 minutes. I'm sure we could come up with something in 20 minutes. I've still got all of these notes here. I've got like 10 pages of topics that we haven't gotten to. So yeah, there's definitely no shortage. But 20 minutes. I think I'm always going to mispronounce his name. Batui? Is that what it was? He brought up a couple weeks ago. I was describing quantitative easing, and he was saying that I wasn't quite describing it right. And so basically it's the difference between quantitative easing and the normal sort of process by which central banks increase the money supply. And quantitative easing, basically I just wanted to address that because I think he was saying that I wasn't quite getting it right. So I just wanted to establish that there is a difference between, there is a normal quantitative easing, and then there's sort of the innovative style of quantitative easing that happened after the 2008 financial crisis. And the mechanism by which central banks increase the money supply is pretty much the same as the mechanism used to engage quantitative easing. It's kind of a matter of scale. You know, with quantitative easing, you're trying to introduce a shock. You're trying to shock the economy into activity by increasing the money supply by a surprisingly large amount. The normal manner in which you increase the money supply is pretty much the same. You just, you know, normally it would just be a day-to-day thing. You wouldn't be dramatic about it. It's quantitative easing is the dramatic increase in the money supply that you would do after a crisis. It's not the sort of administrative day-to-day type thing you would do just over the course of a normal recession or over a normal expansion. And then quantitative easing, that style of quantitative easing is different than the weird shit the Fed has been doing since the '08 financial crisis, because basically that tool was tapped out. The economy was still struggling, but they couldn't do any more quantitative easing because interest rates had already been bottomed out. There just wasn't really much more scope to do it, and so they started innovating. They started buying assets, which normally they don't do. And they actually did buy them with cash, I think. I remember reading that, which normally they would just credit reserve accounts, and I think Vatui even pointed that out. But at some point after the crisis, they actually did dip into the market with cash and pick up assets there. And you know, picking up assets is part of the normal process, but the idea here was to pick up a broad range of assets rather than just treasuries. And the idea was to tap the wealth effect. Basically, the wealth effect is you spend more money if you have more wealth. And it was thought that if they could inflate assets in financial markets, then they could increase consumption and increase demand in the economy that way. That's not what quantitative easing is meant to do. That's a weird quantitative easing mutant policy that they came up with because they wanted to do more to help the economy, but didn't have any more tools. So they started coming up with this sort of innovation. Again, buying assets, trying to get the wealth effect going, buying mortgage-backed securities to try to detoxify the financial system, that kind of thing. That was all sort of innovated, basically, after the fact. So I just wanted to kind of get that out there in recognition of that criticism, to try to kind of give an answer there. Again, if I'm saying stupid shit, please say in chat. I read about this, and this is my understanding of it, but I'm always subject to criticism, and I'm quite fallible, unfortunately. So I do welcome corrections. And then we already talked about Salah getting killed. Oh, do you remember Sariri in Lebanon? He was the prime minister who was made to step down by the Saudis.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about that a while ago. He actually reversed that suspension, or rather, he suspended his resignation. He actually eventually did leave Saudi Arabia. Still left unsaid is whether or not he was being held. It's kind of assumed he wasn't, since he was able to leave, but who's to say? But when he got back into Lebanon, he entered into negotiations with the leader of this Hezbollah-aligned politician. And he actually agreed to suspend his resignation. So he is still Prime Minister of Lebanon and seems set to stay on, which just makes the whole thing more confusing. Nobody knows what the hell is going on. People thought that, well, from what I read, it seemed like the Saudis were pressuring him because he was not sufficiently anti-Hezbollah, that he was not taking a hard enough line on them, and that they wanted him out so that somebody else could come in and kind of fill that role. Or, barring that, Hezbollah could just take over the government, and they could treat Lebanon as a whole as sort of the avatar of Hezbollah and treating it accordingly. But instead, Hariri has just stayed on. So now that theory is toast. Either that was what was happening, and Hariri just stabbed the Saudis in the back, which is kind of would be a humiliation for the Saudis in the region, or there was never any such plan to begin with, and this is just the normal course of Lebanese politics. But if that's the case, it begs the question of what the hell was going on in Saudi Arabia to begin with. We still don't know. So that's all very mysterious, and I haven't really read anything suggesting that there's an answer to that. It's all ambiguous still. So keep an eye on Lebanon, basically, is the takeaway. That could be big things happening there. Could be a lot of nothing, or a big nothing burger, as a certain individual has said before. Oh, I thought this was interesting. The Trump administration was holding up the appointment of WTO arbitration judges. The WTO has a dispute resolution mechanism where if you think that another country is unfairly discriminating against your firms, you can kind of take them to what is effectively court, what is an arbitration hearing. And if they rule in your favor, then you can retaliate, and the other country is kind of obligated legally to remove the discriminatory tariffs or policies or what have you. But the panel has 5 people on it, and the Trump administration is kind of stonewalling on appointing new people as the older people leave. Right now, there's only 4 appointees on the committee, and it seems like they're not going to appoint anyone to replace that 5th member. And it could be, and the suspicion is, the fear is, that the Trump administration will just continue to stonewall, and that as these judges kind of reach the end of their terms, then eventually the committee will not have enough, basically will not have a quorum. They won't have enough people to handle the workload, and the dispute resolution mechanism will just kind of get choked on the workload, on the caseload, such that it will effectively become null and void. Effectively, the WTO would not have a dispute resolution mechanism in that case, and at that point, everybody could just cheat. Nobody would have to honor their WTO obligations because there would be no enforcement mechanism, which would effectively destroy the WTO and the free trade regime that it kind of represents. So there's some anxiety there on the part of free traders that the Trump administration might have this in mind. Still early days, they could just change their mind, and maybe they just want somebody in particular more amenable to American interests to be appointed to the panel, to the committee. But this could evolve in the future into something much bigger. It's basically could be the Trump administration really going after the liberal free trade regime, and it could well deal a significant blow to it. Something to keep an eye on, basically. An early emerging story. It'll play out probably over the course of the next year or two. Oh, Venezuela was in the news. This was interesting. The Venezuelan government banned several opposition groups from participating in the 2018 presidential election. And the idea there is that they did not participate in the recent mayoral elections. And so based on their lack of participation, it was a boycott. They boycotted them. Based on that boycott, the government, or more accurately, the Constitutional Assembly, such as it is, made a rule basically saying that if you boycotted the mayoral elections, then you're not allowed to participate in the presidential election in 2018. Which rules out a lot of the pretty much all of the major opposition groups. That means pretty much they're locked out. So unless the government changes tack, or if the opposition finds some loophole, barring one of those developments, effectively the Chavistas have the government in 2018. They're going to maintain the presidency. So that kind of points to, one, probably future instability in Venezuela, since the opposition is not likely to accept that as being legitimate. But it also points to the inefficacy of boycotts. You kind of have to be careful about how you use those. If a government is very unpopular and lacks legitimacy, then a boycott could be very useful. Because then you can kind of show them, you can kind of signal to society that, you know, this government is not legitimate and now is the time to act and to kind of protest, hit the streets. But if a government still retains a significant amount of legitimacy amongst its core constituents, a boycott basically just cedes power to them, kind of just giving up power to your political opponents. And they can just say, well, they didn't participate, we won the vote fair and square. If they don't like it, then don't boycott. And the government could have enough legitimacy if it has enough support from its core constituents, and if its core constituency is large enough, it could just ride on that legitimacy. And everybody else who protests and says it's not legitimate, well, they may not be numerous enough to topple the government. They could create significant instability with protests, but without that critical mass of support, they won't be able to, and in addition to that, having boycotted, they're locked out of power, significantly limiting the ambit of what they can do, and empowering the government in terms of repression. So boycotts are a tricky strategy, and it's probably been used a little too much by the Venezuelan opposition, much to their detriment. So likely outcome, further instability, further protest in Venezuela, and probably what will de facto be a one-party state after 2018. Oh, this was interesting. The Chinese raised interest rates after the Fed raised their rates recently. And that was a surprise move because the Chinese economy isn't doing all that well. It was thought that, if the Chinese were going to change interest rates, it was thought that they would lower them. The Chinese economy is improving, but it's not particularly strong. It's definitely not strong enough to warrant a rate rise. And so it's thought that they did that to mitigate capital flight. Because, whether money flows into an economy or out of partly depends on interest rates. If interest rates are higher in a given economy, then you can get a greater rate of return by investing in fixed assets, things like bonds and whatnot. So generally when a country raises its interest rates, there's an inflow of money. In China right now, they're trying to mitigate capital flight, so it may be that they just raised rates to try to stem that, to give people more of a reason to keep their money in China. If you're wondering why there's capital flight, that's partly political. There's a lot of concern about the political direction China is taking, and whether or not people with a lot of money will be able to keep it in the future. It may be that the government cracks down on people it perceives as rivals, and it may be that a lot of those people are very powerful. Well, invariably, rivals to the government would be powerful. So a lot of those prospective opponents or political rivals, or even just businessmen who are a little bit concerned, they're all trying to get their money out of China so that the government can't get to it, if indeed there is some big crackdown in the future. Just kind of hedging risk, basically, in that sense. It could also just be part of raising the value of the renminbi, China's currency. There is a push to modernize the economy in China, and part of that means shifting to a consumption-based economy. We've talked a little bit about this before. One way you can do that is to make imports a little bit cheaper. That might be a little bit counterintuitive, because you might think you want a consumption, but well, you want more development in your country, you want more production. Why would you want more imports? Well, the idea is that if people would save money by buying cheaper imports. So the stuff you're not really as competitive at producing will get replaced. You lose that production, but your consumers have more money to spend on other things that you are good at producing. So your competitive advantage gets bolstered. Chinese consumers have more discretionary spending, and that money hypothetically would be spent in China on Chinese producers. So it might be that this is a part of that modernization scheme, an effort to make imports a little cheaper. Imports would be cheaper because China's currency would increase in value with an interest rate rise. As the interest rates go up, more money comes in, and as more money comes in, the country's currency increases in value, which in turn makes imports cheaper. So that could also be the logic there. I might add that this is interesting because China actually has strict capital controls. There's this idea in economics, the Holy Trinity. And the idea is that you can have fixed exchange rates, free flow of capital, or independent monetary policy. You can have, those are the three things you can have, but you can only have two of them at once. Because the third one is invariably needed to facilitate the other two. So in China, they effectively have, people say they have a fixed exchange rate. They actually don't. What they have is a band that it's allowed to move in. That's not exactly floating, but it's not really fixed either. So effectively, they have a floating exchange rate. In turn, they also have an independent monetary policy. Well, all right, I'm getting this wrong. It is effectively a fixed exchange rate and an independent monetary policy. And they facilitate those two things with capital controls. You can't have free flow of capital if you want the other two. I apologize, I'm confused. That was needlessly confusing. Effectively, they have to have the capital controls in order to have fixed exchange rates and independent monetary policy. So you would think then, with strong capital controls, they would not have a problem with capital flight, because you would think it would be easy to contain the capital in the country with the capital controls. Not the case. It's apparently a very porous capital control system. A lot of people in China have found very ingenious ways of getting their money out of the country. And the result of that porous system of capital controls is that they had to switch to one of the other three. They had to basically they had to not trade away the independent monetary policy. If you're raising interest rates for reasons other than your economy overheating or not overheating or struggling, in that case, your monetary policy is not really independent. And so that's what's happened. They've compromised the independence of their monetary policy in order to stem that capital flight. Again, that's hypothetical. Nobody knows exactly why. But again, the theory in the article I read was that capital flight could also be part of the modernization program, but that's kind of conjecture on my part. Oh, and Japan is buying cruise missiles. I thought that was interesting. The Abe administration is looking to acquire cruise missiles, predicated on the logic that North Korea could launch a nuclear weapon at Japan. And if the Japanese were able to get some kind of warning about that, they want to have the capability to launch a strike against the launch sites to prevent the launch of the weapons. That's a very specific situation. That's the concern is that they would probably end up using them for something else besides that relatively unlikely circumstance. But the Abe administration is justifying the acquisition in those terms. I shouldn't say acquisition. It's they want to acquire them. They have not yet acquired them or are in the process of buying them, but they're looking at it. They're moving in that direction. They want to acquire cruise missiles. And that ties into the Abe administration's push to kind of normalize Japan's military and its foreign policy and whatnot, because Japan does not technically have a formal military. There is no defense department in Japan. They have the self-defense forces, but they are not technically recognized as a military per se, just self-defense forces. And they don't have their own department in the Japanese government. And so effectively they do have a military, and so the Abe administration is kind of trying to be realistic by recognizing that fact and organizing the government accordingly. But some people don't like it because they see it as a betrayal of as an effort to part of his effort to remove the pacifist clause in Japan's constitution. You know, for critics of the Abe administration, they think Abe does not just want to normalize, so to speak, the organizational charts of Japan's government vis-a-vis its military. They think he also wants to go beyond that to removing the pacifist clause to allow him to use Japan's military to go overseas, get involved in conflicts, or what have you. Who knows what. Basically just the same kind of power that any country with a large military would have. The administration in Tokyo would be able to wield that power like a normal country that did not have a pacifist clause in its constitution.
We've talked about Abe quite a bit over the course of these discussions, and how North Korea is kind of giving him the reason that he needs to escalate Japanese military.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's kind of... well, he was already pushing for it, and he already had his own bevy of excuses. You know, one of them was the need to support the United States. You know, technically it was not legal for the Japanese armed forces to support the United States if the United States were engaged in a military operation that involved defending Japan. Mm-hmm. Well, any operation, but even an operation that involved defending Japan, technically the Japanese self-defense forces could not assist them, because that would involve deploying, you know, outside Japan. Only the self-defense forces legally could only do operations that involved the direct defense of Japan itself, not necessarily helping somebody else engaging in an operation that was also doing that. That seemed to be a bit ridiculous, so the Abe administration reinterpreted the pacifist clause of the Constitution to allow the Japanese military to do that. Some people thought that was common sense. Other people said it's the thin end of the wedge. This is just him trying to pave the way for larger changes, larger reforms. And actually, the original change was intended to be larger. It was intended to be written such that Japan could help an ally anywhere, pretty much. But the Constitutional Court, I think it was, narrowed that down, or maybe it was just political infighting within the Abe coalition, because there is a Buddhist political party in the coalition that is not comfortable with removing the pacification clause. But whatever the case, the original change was shifted such that it was that the self-defense forces could only help an allied military if that other military was engaged in an operation directly involving Japan. Not just any operation, but specifically one that involved defending Japan. So still pretty narrow circumstance in which the self-defense forces can be deployed in an operation that is not directly related to defending, actually defending specifically Japan. And that's part of a pattern, basically. But yeah, North Korea has definitely fed into that. It's been a convenient excuse for the Abe administration to push that line that they need to modernize the military, build it up, and reform its legal standing, its position with vis-a-vis the Constitution. I thought some of the little tidbits here were interesting, specifically examples of the Abe administration kind of bending the law to try to push its perspective of what the military's role should be and how it should be legally. For one, it's actually written in law in Japan that the Japanese Navy cannot have a carrier. But they do have a carrier. The way they get around that is they just don't call it a carrier, they call it a destroyer. I think a helicopter destroyer is the technical designation. So it's a carrier in all but name, and it is a small carrier. It's not like a Nimitz-class carrier like what the U.S. has. It really is kind of a helicopter carrier. But it is still a carrier, and technically that should be illegal, but because they labeled it a destroyer, the helicopter destroyer, they managed to get around the law. So that's one example of the Abe administration kind of cheating there.
That's not an apple. Wait, that's not a potato. That's an apple of the earth. Let's rename everything. It's not a potato.
I mean, it worked. I mean, legally that was accepted. Another thing they did is peacekeeping operations. Those have been controversial in the past, but the government was able to, I think it was part of the reinterpretation maybe, I'm not sure exactly, but they were able to send a peacekeeping force to South Sudan, and that was, I think, one of the first peacekeeping forces Japan has sent overseas. It was armed. They've sent people as part of peacekeeping missions, but they were never soldiers, really. So this was the first armed peacekeeping mission involving Japanese soldiers. And I hope I'm getting that right, but as I understand it, that's the case. And that actually led to some controversy later when there was some violence involving the soldiers, more accurately against the soldiers. Supposedly some soldiers were killed, and the government was kind of accused of trying to cover it up, and that led to one major resignation, I think, of the Japanese equivalent of the Secretary of Defense, basically. But that was another example. They're not kind of supposed to do armed peacekeeping operations, but they kind of finagled it. And then there was changing the rules, changing the law to allow exports of military equipment. It's written in Japanese law that the government, or rather, Japan generally, is explicitly forbidden from exporting military equipment. And that law was modified or reinterpreted such that Japan can export non-lethal military equipment. So it can't export weapons, but now it can export other things like, say, a maritime surveillance aircraft that you might use to try to find submarines, transport aircraft, intelligence equipment, surveillance equipment, reconnaissance equipment, things like that, the ISR type stuff. And they also, that change in the rule was also part of a shift that would allow Japanese defense firms to cooperate with overseas defense firms. So hypothetically, a Japanese defense firm could now enter into an agreement with an American defense firm, for example, and engage in a joint project. Before, that wasn't really legal. You could have an agreement where equipment is manufactured in Japan, like part of the F-35 is manufactured in Japan. But you could not engage in a joint research and development project to develop new weapon systems or new equipment. That wasn't quite legal. So that was changed so that it could be done. So all of that has pacifists in Japan kind of paranoid, because it forms a pattern of behavior where the Japanese government seems to be wanting to become more active in that military sphere. And maybe they're telling the truth that they just want to do that to shore up Japan's security vis-a-vis a rising China and China's military becoming more powerful. Maybe it is just for defensive purposes to make the defense industry more vibrant, more independent, more able to kind of stand up and produce the equipment to meet the needs of the Japanese military. But the fear is that maybe they'll go and do some crazy shit, that maybe they'll get involved in one of America's little misadventures, or maybe they'll have a misadventure of their own. I mean, there's a lot of paranoia there in that regard, and it's not really clear yet just what agenda the Japanese government might have beyond just normalization, quote unquote.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Something to watch.
I think that's right around the time I wanted to be on for. It was a fun session with you. Thanks for coming on again.
Well, thanks for having me. Always fun.
Next weekend we'll be off for Christmas, but we'll be back the weekend after that.
Sounds good.
So everyone, enjoy your holidays. Be safe. Thank you, Dorak, for managing the questions this evening, and the mods for helping the chat out.
Thank you, Dorak. Much appreciated.
Yep. And we'll see you on the next time. Okay, so I'm going to host Cerberus. He's a real-life friend of mine.